Hi guys, tonight we're stepping back into a world that feels almost like another planet, long before cities, long before writing, and long before anything you would recognize as modern life. You find yourself in a cold, wide landscape shaped by ice age winds, where human beings live in small, mobile groups, and every single day is a quiet negotiation with survival. There are no roads, no permanent shelters, only the slow rhythm of movement, firelight, and memory passed from one generation to another. The air feels sharper here, the silence deeper, as if the world itself is still learning how to be lived in. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, leave a comment with your location and what time it is where you are watching from. Now, dim the lights. You're no longer in a modern room. You're standing on the edge of a prehistoric world that stretches endlessly under a pale, wide sky. The first thing you notice is the cold. Not just a chill, but a deep, persistent presence that seems to settle into everything. The ground beneath your feet is a mixture of frozen soil and old grasses bent low by wind. In the distance, faint shapes of animals move slowly, careful and alert, always aware that survival depends on not being careless even for a moment. Scientifically speaking, this moment belongs to a time around 50,000 years ago, during the Upper Paleolithic period, when modern humans were already present in Eurasia and adapting to extreme Ice Age environments. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by archaeological evidence from tools, bones, and settlement traces. Yet even with all this evidence, the world you are seeing still holds gaps that science continues to fill piece by piece. You begin to walk slowly, and the world around you reveals a scattered pattern of life. Small groups of humans are not settled in one place for long. They move with the seasons, following herds of animals and the shifting availability of plants. Their homes are temporary, made from wood, bone, and animal hide stretched tightly against wind. A common misconception is that prehistoric humans lived constantly in hardship, without moments of comfort or routine. But archaeological findings suggest something more balanced. There were structured daily patterns, shared responsibilities, and even periods of rest that allowed social bonds to form and strengthen. You notice a faint glow ahead. As you move closer, the smell of smoke becomes stronger, carried on the wind. It is not unpleasant, but earthy and grounding, like wood slowly breaking down into warmth and light. Around the fire, a small group gathers. Their clothing is made from animal hides, carefully scraped and stitched using bone needles. You can see the texture of fur and leather, layered to protect against freezing nights. Their movements are slow and deliberate, shaped by generations of learned survival. One quirky detail from archaeological research is that some prehistoric groups used natural pigments, not only for cave art but also for decorating their bodies and tools. Red ochre, in particular, appears frequently in excavation sites, and researchers believe it may have been used for symbolic or social purposes rather than practical survival alone. You crouch near the fire. The flames flicker and shift, casting long shadows that dance across the ground. Someone is tending it carefully, adding small pieces of wood at a steady pace. Fire here is not just warmth, it is protection, cooking, light, and companionship all at once. Scholars remain divided on how controlled and intentional early fire use truly was at this stage of human history. Some argue that groups maintained fire continuously once they learned to create it, while others suggest that fire was often opportunistic, carried from place to place rather than reliably produced. You listen to the soft sounds around the camp. There is no spoken language you can understand, but communication is happening constantly. A tilt of the head, a hand gesture, a shared glance toward the horizon. Meaning exists without words, shaped by familiarity and trust built over years of living together. Nearby, someone is shaping a stone tool. You watch closely as a piece of flint is struck with another stone. A sharp edge flakes off with a precise sound. This is not random. It is learned skill, passed down through observation and repetition. These tools are essential for cutting meat, preparing hides, and surviving in a world where nothing is easily given. The camp itself feels temporary but organized. Sleeping areas are arranged in loose clusters. Food is stored in hidden spots or shared immediately depending on the situation. Everything is light enough to be carried when the group moves again. You might wonder how people decided when to move. The answer is not simple. It depends on animal migration patterns, seasonal plant growth, and environmental pressure. Ice Age climates were not stable, and survival required constant attention to subtle changes in the land. A gentle wind passes through the camp carrying distant animal calls. For a moment, everything feels suspended, as if the world is holding its breath. You realize how much of life here depends on awareness, not just strength, but observation. There is a quiet intelligence in how this group exists, not written, not spoken in complex sentences, but lived through action and memory. Every person contributes. Every role matters. Even the smallest task has meaning. And as you remain here, at the edge of their world, you begin to understand that survival 50,000 years ago was not only about enduring the cold, it was about learning how to belong to a landscape that could change without warning, and still finding moments of warmth within it. You remain near the edge of the prehistoric camp as the firelight softens and the surrounding world begins to shift into the slower rhythm of early morning activity. The Ice Age landscape is still cold, still vast, but now it feels slightly less empty as movement returns to it. People are waking, stretching, adjusting hides and fur layers that have stiffened through the night. There is no rush, only necessity. A quiet understanding that the day begins when the body is ready, not when a clock demands it. Scientifically speaking, Upper Paleolithic humans around 50,000 years ago lived in small, mobile bands that typically range from a dozen to a few dozen individuals. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by archaeological site sizes and resource distribution patterns. These groups were not random gatherings. They were structured communities shaped by kinship, cooperation, and shared survival strategies. As you move deeper into the camp, you notice how the shelters are arranged. They are low and close to the ground, built from wooden frames covered with animal hides. Some are reinforced with bones from large animals, a reminder of how nothing in this environment is wasted. The structures look fragile at first glance, but they're carefully designed to withstand wind and snow. A lesser-known detail from archaeological studies is that some prehistoric camps show repeated rebuilding in the same general locations, suggesting that early humans may have returned to familiar sites seasonally, rather than constantly moving to entirely new territory. This challenges the old assumption that they were always wandering without attachment to place. You see someone stepping out of a shelter, rubbing their hands together to restore warmth. Their breath is visible in the cold air. Nearby, another person is already tending to tasks near the fire, checking embers that have been carefully preserved through the night. Fire maintenance is a constant responsibility, not a one-time achievement. Scholars remain divided on whether prehistoric groups assigned specific individuals to firekeeping duties, or whether it was a shared, rotating responsibility. Some researchers suggest early forms of role specialization may have existed, while others argue that labor was more fluid and communal. You notice children moving between adults, observing quietly. They are not formally taught in the way modern education works. Instead, they learn by watching, repeating, and gradually being trusted with small tasks. A child might be given a light object to carry, or asked to mimic a simple action like gathering twigs. There is something deeply human in this slow transfer of knowledge. It does not feel structured, but it is incredibly effective. Skills are embedded in daily life, not separated from it. As you walk a little further, you come across a group preparing food. Pieces of meat are being cut with stone tools, their edges sharp enough to slice through muscle and tendon. The process is careful and methodical. Nothing is rushed because waste would mean loss of survival advantage. One quirky archaeological finding is that cut marks on animal bones from this period often show consistent patterns, allowing researchers to identify not only what animals were hunted, but also how butchering techniques were shared across groups. It suggests that knowledge travelled between communities, even without written language. You might wonder how they managed to coordinate such tasks without formal instruction. The answer lies in repetition and proximity. Everyone sees everything. Everyone participates. Learning is constant and unavoidable. In the background, the landscape itself feels alive with subtle movement. Distant herds shift across open plains, their presence known more by instinct and observation than by direct sight. Humans here are always aware of the land as something that changes, breathes, and responds. A gentle comparison to modern life comes naturally here. Today, many people wake up to artificial light and structured schedules, but here, time is shaped by temperature, hunger, and light itself. The sun rising is not just a visual event, it is a signal for activity, warmth, and movement. You notice a quiet interaction between two adults near the edge of the camp. No words you can understand are spoken, yet meaning is clearly exchanged. A gesture toward the horizon, a nod, a pause. It might indicate a planned movement or awareness of distant animals. Communication is layered and efficient. Archaeological evidence suggests that symbolic thinking was already present in humans of this era, shown through the use of pigments, carved objects, and possibly early forms of ornamentation. This is a mainstream historical fact. Though scholars still debate how complex or abstract these symbolic systems truly were, some researchers believe these behaviours represent the early foundations of culture as we understand it. Others suggest they may have been more practical or situational than symbolic in a modern sense. As the camp becomes more active, you start to feel the rhythm of cooperation. No single person dominates the group. Instead, survival depends on alignment, awareness, and shared timing. Even silence feels coordinated, as if everyone understands when to act and when to simply observe. The wind shifts slightly, carrying the scent of smoke, animal hides, and cold earth. It is a simple mixture, but it defines this world completely. You realize that smell here is as informative as sight. It tells stories of fire, movement, and life continuing through harsh conditions. And as you stand among them, still unseen, still observing, you begin to understand that this world is not chaotic at all. It is carefully balanced, shaped by thousands of small decisions made every hour, every day, by people who never knew they were part of history. They are simply living, moment by moment, in a world that demands attention, patience, and quiet endurance. You move away from the waking camp and begin to follow a faint path worn into the frozen ground. It is not a road in any modern sense, but a memory of movement. Repeated footsteps, seasonal returns, and careful navigation have shaped it over time. The Ice Age world opens wider here, and you feel how small the camp truly is compared to everything surrounding it. Scientifically speaking, Upper Paleolithic humans around 50,000 years ago relied heavily on stone tool technology, particularly flint and similar materials that could be shaped into sharp cutting edges. This is a mainstream historical fact confirmed through thousands of archaeological finds across Europe, Africa, and Asia. These tools were not random creations but carefully planned instruments designed for hunting, butchering, and survival tasks. As you walk, you notice scattered stones along the ground that are not naturally shaped. Some are sharp flakes, Others are cores from which pieces have been removed. This is where tools were made. A small workspace, reused many times, left behind like a quiet signature of human presence. A lesser-known archaeological detail is that some tool-making sites show evidence of long-term learning spaces where inexperienced individuals practiced under the observation of skilled tool makers. It suggests that knowledge transfer may have been more structured than once believed. You imagine sitting beside such a workspace. The sound of stone striking stone would be constant, rhythmic, almost meditative. Each strike requires precision. Too strong, and the stone shatters. Too weak, and nothing happens. Skill is built slowly, over years, not moments. Scholars still debate whether early humans had standardized teaching methods for tool production, or whether learning was entirely observational and informal. Some argue that the consistency of tool shapes across vast regions suggests intentional instruction, while others believe imitation alone could explain the patterns. As you continue forward, the landscape shifts slightly. Open grasslands stretch ahead, broken by clusters of low shrubs and distant tree lines. The air feels colder here, less protected by the presence of the camp. You become aware of how exposed early humans must have felt when travelling through such environments. You notice faint impressions in the ground, tracks. Some are small, likely from deer or similar animals. Others are larger, deeper, indicating heavier creatures moving through the same space. For prehistoric humans, reading these signs would have been as natural as reading words on a page. One quirky detail from archaeological interpretation is that some ancient trackways suggest humans sometimes followed animal paths not only for hunting, but also for navigation, using predictable migration routes as natural highways through unfamiliar terrain. You pause for a moment, imagining how much attention every detail would require. A broken branch might mean recent movement. A disturbed patch of grass might signal danger or opportunity. Nothing is ignored. In modern life, navigation is often outsourced to devices and maps, but here, direction is stored in memory, observation, and shared experience. A mental map replaces any physical guide. As you move further, you begin to understand how deeply connected survival is to environmental awareness. The wind changes direction slightly, and with it, the soundscape shifts. Distant animal calls carry differently depending on terrain and air temperature. Even sound becomes a tool. You come across a shallow river. The water is cold and clear, moving steadily over stones shaped by centuries of flow. This is a critical resource. Water determines settlement patterns, travel routes, and even social interaction zones. Archaeological evidence shows that many prehistoric camps were located near reliable water sources. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by settlement distribution studies. However, scholars remain divided on whether proximity to water was the primary factor in site selection, or one of several competing priorities such as hunting access and shelter availability. You crouch near the river bank. The sound of water is steady, almost calming. You notice footprints near the edge, some older, some fresher. Life passes through here continuously, even if no one stays for long. A gentle comparison arises. Today, water flows into homes through pipes, often unnoticed. Here, it is something you must find, follow, and protect. It shapes every decision. As you continue along the river, you spot signs of human activity again. A few scattered stones arranged in a rough circle. Perhaps a temporary rest point, perhaps a place where food was prepared or tools were repaired. Nothing permanent remains, but everything leaves traces. Some researchers suggest that these temporary sites may have functioned as meeting points between different groups, allowing exchange of materials, ideas, or even social bonds. Others argue that such interpretations may overstate the complexity of these interactions. You sit for a moment near the water, imagining the flow of time here. generations passing through the same landscape, leaving only faint marks behind. The wind picks up slightly, and the surface of the river ripples. You realize how much of this world is in motion. Animals move, humans move, water moves, even the land itself changes slowly over time. And yet, within all this movement, there is stability and rhythm. Return to fire, return to water, return to known paths. Survival is not about permanence. It is about pattern. As you rise again and continue walking, the distant camp is no longer visible, but its presence still feels close, like a point of warmth in a vast, cold world. You leave the river behind and begin to notice that the world feels quieter in a different way now. Not silent, but more intentional. Every movement seems to carry meaning even when no sound is made. The Ice Age landscape stretches wide around you, but your attention is pulled towards something smaller, more intimate. The way people here understand each other without speaking. Early human groups around 50,000 years ago lived in a world where complex spoken language was likely developing or already partially established, though its exact form remains uncertain. This is widely supported by cognitive archaeology and fossil evidence of brain development. What is clear is that communication was already far more advanced than simple instinctive calls or signals. You find yourself approaching a small gathering. Several individuals are sitting or standing in a loose circle. There is no spoken dialogue you can recognize, yet everything feels coordinated. A hand rises slightly, fingers flexing in a specific pattern. Another person responds with a tilt of the head and a slow shift in posture. The exchange is immediate, almost seamless. It becomes clear that meaning here is carried through gesture, timing, and shared understanding built over years of living together. You realize how much of communication does not require words at all, even in your own world, though here it is the foundation of survival. One widely accepted archaeological interpretation is that early humans relied heavily on multimodal communication systems, combining vocal sounds, facial expression, and body movement. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by comparative studies with both fossil evidence and modern hunter-gatherer societies. You notice a small interaction that seems simple at first. One person points toward the horizon, then pauses. Another responds by touching their chest and then gesturing toward the ground. There is no urgency, yet there is clarity. You sense that information is being exchanged about direction, resources, or perhaps timing of movement. A lesser-known detail from ethnographic comparisons is that many modern indigenous groups still use highly sophisticated gesture systems alongside spoken language, which helps researchers imagine how early communication may have functioned before fully developed syntax existed. You crouch slightly to observe more closely. A child nearby imitates an adult gesture, not perfectly, but enough that the group responds with subtle acknowledgement. There is learning happening here without instruction, absorbed through presence alone. You begin to understand that communication is not a separate activity in this world. It is woven into every action, carrying food, adjusting clothing, tending fire, even sitting still all carry communicative weight depending on context. Scholars remain divided on whether fully structured language had already emerged in human populations at this time, or whether complex speech developed later in multiple regions independently. Some argue that symbolic thinking evident in artifacts implies advanced language, while others caution that material evidence alone cannot fully confirm linguistic structure. The group shifts slightly, and you notice a change in energy. Someone gestures toward a cluster of trees. Another responds with a slow nod and rises. No words are spoken, yet a decision has clearly been made. Movement will happen soon. You follow at a distance, trying to decode what you see. The gestures are not random. They are precise, shaped by repetition and necessity. A raised hand might signal attention, a lowered palm might indicate calm or restraint. A quick glance followed by stillness might communicate caution. One quirky observation from experimental archaeology is that researchers attempting to reconstruct prehistoric communication systems often find themselves naturally developing consistent gesture patterns within groups, even without prior planning, suggesting that human bodies may instinctively organize meaning through movement. You walk alongside them now, though still unnoticed. The path is familiar from earlier, but the way it is discussed, or rather enacted, feels different. Instead of explaining direction, they simply move, pause, confirm, and continue. Each step is part of conversation. A gentle comparison comes to mind. In your world today, communication often depends on devices, written messages, and structured language. Here, meaning is immediate, embodied, and always present in the physical world. You observe a moment where coordination becomes especially clear. One person stops suddenly. The others halt almost instantly without visible confusion. A hand gesture follows, small and controlled. The group adjusts direction slightly, avoiding a patch of uneven ground or perhaps responding to something unseen by you. Archaeological findings of spatial organization in prehistoric camps suggest that early humans had strong awareness of shared movement patterns and likely coordinated group travel with remarkable efficiency. This is widely accepted in anthropology based on settlement spacing and tool distribution patterns. You begin to feel how trust operates in this environment. It is not declared. It is demonstrated through response time, consistency, and shared understanding. Every individual must be attentive, because misunderstanding could have consequences in a landscape where danger and opportunity are both subtle. A small detail catches your attention. Two individuals exchange a series of gestures that repeat a familiar pattern. It feels almost ritualized, though not necessarily ceremonial. It might be a confirmation of understanding, or a reinforcement of shared intent. Some researchers suggest that repeated gesture sequences like these may represent early forms of proto-syntax, though others argue they could simply be habitual coordination signals without linguistic structure. The group continues moving, and you realize how exhausting it would be to maintain this level of awareness constantly. Yet for them, it is not exhausting in the way you might expect. It is natural, like breathing. Awareness is not effort. It is life. As you walk, the wind passes through the grass, creating a soft rustling sound. Someone gestures toward the sound briefly, then relaxes. Perhaps it is nothing. Perhaps it is simply acknowledgement of the environment. You begin to see how communication here is not just between individuals, but between people and their surroundings. The land itself becomes part of interpretation. Movement, sound, and silence all contribute to shared understanding. And as you continue forward with them, still silent, still observing, you realize something subtle but profound. In this world, to understand someone is not to hear their words. It is to move with them, to notice what they notice, and to exist in the same rhythm of attention. You continue walking with the group until the landscape begins to change again, slowly at first, almost unnoticeable, as if the world is gently shifting its texture. The open grasslands give way to scattered patches of stone and low wind-carved ridges. The air feels different here, carrying a faint warmth from the fire that you have not yet seen, but already feel present in the way people move with more certainty. Around 50,000 years ago, fire was not simply a tool but a central anchor of daily life for early human communities. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by widespread archaeological evidence, including burned hearths, ash layers, and heat-altered stones found across multiple prehistoric sites. Fire shaped where people gathered, how they ate, and how long they stayed in one place. You begin to smell it before you see it. A thin thread of smoke drifting upward, dissolving into the cold sky. As you follow the group, the smoke grows stronger, more structured, as if the air itself is becoming organized around heat. Then you see it, a small fire circle, partially shielded by stones and windbreaks made of wood and hide. It is not a roaring blaze, but a controlled, steady presence. The flames move gently, never wasting energy, always carefully fed. One lesser-known archaeological observation is that many prehistoric hearths show repeated use over long periods, sometimes with layers of ash that indicate generations returning to the same fire spots. This suggests continuity of place and memory, even in mobile societies. You step closer and feel the warmth spread across your skin. It is immediate and grounding, a contrast to the surrounding cold that never truly leaves. People here move around the fire with practiced familiarity, as if it is both center and compass. A widely discussed scholarly interpretation is that fire control may have been one of the most important factors in human cognitive development, influencing social bonding, food processing, and even sleep patterns. However, researchers still debate whether early groups maintained fire continuously or relied on frequent reignition from natural sources. You notice someone carefully tending the embers. They use a long stick to shift glowing pieces of wood, controlling airflow with subtle movements. Nearby, another person prepares food. Pieces of meat are placed near heat rather than directly in flame, a slow process that transforms texture and flavour. The smell is rich and earthy, mixed with smoke and something deeply organic that you cannot quite place. It is not refined, but it is deeply functional. Nothing here exists without purpose. A quirky detail from experimental archaeology is that when researchers attempt to replicate prehistoric cooking methods, they often find that even small changes in fire temperature or placement drastically alter food quality, highlighting how skilled early humans likely were in managing heat without modern tools. You sit at the edge of the firelight. The group does not react to you, yet you feel fully included in their rhythm. There is a sense that presence itself is enough. No invitation is required. Survival depends on shared space, and fire defines that space more than anything else. Children are nearby, watching closely. One of them holds a small stick and imitates the motion of an adult tending the fire. There is no instruction, only observation and repetition. Occasionally, an adult glances over and gives a subtle nod, acknowledging progress without interrupting the moment. Scholars remain divided on how intentional early teaching behaviours were in relation to fire management. Some argue that knowledge was deliberately passed through structured demonstration, while others suggest it emerged naturally through cohabitation and repeated exposure. You notice how the fire influences everything around it. Conversations, though still non-verbal, cluster near its light. Movement slows. Attention narrows. Even silence feels different here, softer, more shared. In modern life, fire has been replaced by electricity, heating systems, and screens. Yet here it remains a living presence that must be constantly maintained. It cannot be ignored or automated. It demands participation. Someone adds a small bundle of dried grass to the fire. The flames respond immediately, rising slightly before settling again. The group watches briefly, then returns to their tasks. There is no ceremony, only continuity. You realize that fire is not just survival, it is structure. It defines time in a way that feels almost invisible but deeply present. Morning fire, midday fire, night fire. Each carries a different meaning depending on intensity and purpose. A gentle shift occurs as you observe interactions around the campfire. People begin exchanging small items, not formally trading, but passing objects that may include tools, food portions, or materials for repair. Everything moves slowly, deliberately. One widely accepted anthropological idea is that fire-centered gathering spaces may have played a crucial role in the development of early social organization, providing a stable environment for communication and cooperation. This remains a mainstream historical fact supported by settlement pattern analysis. You notice that no one sits too far from the fire for long. Even those performing tasks outside its immediate glow return frequently, as if drawn by an invisible rhythm. A faint wind passes through, briefly disturbing the flames. Everyone adjusts slightly without breaking focus. The fire stabilizes quickly, as if the group itself corrects it. Some researchers suggest that early human emotional regulation may have been influenced by fire presence, creating shared calming effects that strengthened group cohesion. Others caution that such interpretations may project modern psychology onto ancient behavior. As the light shifts, shadows lengthen and soften. The world beyond the fire circle feels farther away now, less defined. Inside this space, everything becomes simpler, slower, more connected. You remain there quietly, observing how something so basic can hold so much meaning. Heat, light, smoke, presence, all of it working together without words. And as the fire continues to burn steadily into the cold prehistoric evening, you begin to understand that for these early humans, survival is not just about enduring the world around them, but about gathering it into a single shared point of warmth. You stay close to the fire for a while longer, but eventually the group begins to shift again, as if the day itself has its own quiet instructions. People rise without urgency, gather simple tools, and prepare to move outward into the surrounding landscape. There is no announcement, no single leader calling for action, only a shared awareness that the moment for activity has arrived. In the Upper Paleolithic period, mobility was a defining feature of human life. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by settlement archaeology and the distribution of stone tools across wide geographic regions. Groups moved in response to seasonal resources, animal migration patterns, and environmental changes that could be subtle or sudden. You follow as they leave the fire behind. The warmth fades quickly, replaced again by cold air that feels sharper now after time spent near heat. The land opens in front of you, vast and uneven, shaped by ancient glaciers and long winds that never seem to stop. A lesser-known detail from archaeological research is that many prehistoric travel routes appear to follow natural topography like ridgelines and river valleys, suggesting that early humans used landscape features as guiding structures rather than relying on fixed paths. The group spreads slightly as they walk, but never too far apart. Each person maintains awareness of the others through movement and occasional gesture. You notice how often they glance toward the horizon, scanning not only for animals but for changes in terrain, weather, or sound. Scholars remain divided on whether prehistoric mobility was highly planned in advance or largely reactive to immediate environmental conditions. Some researchers argue that seasonal migration maps may have existed in shared memory, while others believe decisions were made continuously based on daily observation. As you move with them, the ground beneath your feet becomes more varied. Patches of frozen earth give way to softer soil, then to areas scattered with stones worn smooth by time. Each step feels like entering a different version of the same world. You notice someone pause briefly and crouch near the ground. They examine faint marks, perhaps tracks left by animals passing earlier. Their attention is intense, focused, almost meditative. After a moment, they signal to others with a simple hand movement, and the group adjusts direction slightly. A quirky observation from experimental archaeology is that even modern humans, when placed in survival training scenarios, often develop rapid and accurate track reading skills within days, suggesting that this ability may be deeply rooted in human cognition. You begin to understand how much information is constantly flowing through this group without spoken explanation. The land itself is like a constantly updating map, and everyone is trained to read it. The wind shifts again, carrying a colder draft from the north. The group reacts subtly, adjusting clothing and tightening wraps made from animal hide. There is no complaint, no pause. Adaptation is continuous and silent. In modern life, weather is often something checked in advance through forecasts. Here, it is experienced directly, moment by moment, through skin, breath, and sound. You notice a distant movement ahead. At first it is unclear, just a faint disruption in the horizon line. Then it becomes more defined. A herd of animals moving slowly across open ground. The group responds immediately, not with excitement, but with controlled attention. One widely accepted archaeological interpretation is that early human survival depended heavily on opportunistic hunting strategies rather than constant pursuit. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by bone assemblages and toolware patterns found at excavation sites. You watch as the group slows their pace. They spread slightly, using terrain for cover. Communication becomes even more minimal now. Only essential gestures remain. Everything else is absorbed into silence. A small, almost overlooked detail from prehistoric studies is that some hunting sites show evidence of repeated coordination strategies, suggesting that groups may have refined their techniques over generations through shared experience rather than isolated attempts. Scholars still debate whether early humans developed structured hunting roles, such as designated chasers, blockers, or drivers, or whether these roles emerged spontaneously each time based on situation and terrain. You remain at a distance, not interfering, simply observing. The herd continues moving, unaware of your presence. The animals are large, adapted to cold environments, their breath visible in the air as they move in steady rhythm. The group does not rush. There is patience here, a kind of quiet timing that feels very different from modern urgency. Every movement is measured, waiting for the right moment rather than forcing one. You notice how attention is distributed. No single person seems entirely responsible. Instead, awareness is shared across the group like a collective field of focus. A gentle comparison arises. In modern life, tasks are often divided into individual responsibility. Here, responsibility is fluid, shared, and constantly adjusted. The herd shifts direction slightly, and the group mirrors this change without breaking formation. It feels almost like a conversation without words, where movement itself is the language. You begin to realize how deeply survival depends on perception, not just seeing, but interpreting correctly. A small mistake in reading movement or wind could change everything. As the group settles into position, you feel a subtle tension in the air, not fear, but readiness. The landscape itself seems to hold still for a moment, as if waiting for an outcome that has not yet arrived. And as you stand among them, quietly moving with their rhythm, you understand that this world is built on attention. Every breath, every step, every glance carries meaning, and nothing is ever truly random. You leave behind the quiet tension of the distant herd and follow the group as they veer away from the open plains. The movement is gradual, almost cautious, as if they are deciding not only where to go, but what kind of world they want to step into next. The landscape changes again, and this time it feels softer, more layered, with scattered patches of vegetation appearing more frequently between stones and frozen ground. During this period of the Upper Paleolithic, human groups were highly dependent on mixed diets that included both hunted animals and gathered plant foods. This is a widely supported conclusion in archaeology, based on isotopic analysis of ancient remains and tool residue studies. It shows that survival was not based on a single strategy, but on flexibility and constant adaptation. You notice the group slowing near the edge of a lightly wooded area. Trees are sparse here, shaped by cold winds and long winters, but they still provide shelter, resources, and a different kind of silence. The air smells different too, less open, more contained, with hints of bark, damp earth, and crushed leaves underfoot. A lesser-known archaeological observation is that prehistoric gathering sites often show seasonal variation in plant use, suggesting that early humans had detailed knowledge of when and where specific edible resources would appear throughout the year. You watch as individuals begin to split into smaller clusters. Some move toward bushes, others toward the base of trees, scanning the ground with practiced attention. Their movements are slow and deliberate, never rushed, as if the landscape itself requires careful conversation before anything is taken from it. Scholars remain divided on how much ecological knowledge early humans retained across generations. Some argue that this knowledge was highly structured and culturally transmitted, while others suggest it was more experiential and constantly relearned through direct interaction with the environment. You crouch near one group as they examine low-growing plants. One person gently pulls something from the soil, brushing away frost and dirt before inspecting it closely. There is hesitation, then a small nod. It is placed into a woven container made of plant fibers and hide strips. A quirky detail from experimental archaeology is that researchers who attempt to identify prehistoric edible plants often struggle not because the plants are rare, but because seasonal variations can dramatically change appearance and taste, making long-term ecological memory essential for survival. You begin to understand that gathering here is not passive. It requires as much skill as hunting, just in a different form. Attention is directed downward instead of outward, toward details that modern eyes might easily overlook. The forest edge feels quieter than the plains, but it is not empty. Small movements catch your eye. Birds shifting between branches, insects hidden in bark, faint disturbances in the undergrowth that suggest unseen life moving constantly through this space. One widely accepted archaeological interpretation is that early human foraging strategies were deeply integrated with seasonal migration cycles, allowing groups to exploit multiple ecological zones throughout the year. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by settlement distribution and food residue analysis. You notice how communication changes here. It becomes even more subtle, a glance downward, a slight pause, a quiet shift in direction. Everyone seems to understand that sound must be minimized, as if the forest itself is listening. In modern life, food is often separated from its source by distance and packaging. Here, every piece of food is directly connected to the land, requiring knowledge, patience, and careful selection. A small detail catches your attention. One individual pauses near a cluster of plants and signals another over. There is a brief exchange of gestures, followed by careful harvesting. It feels almost instructional, though nothing is spoken. Some researchers suggest that plant gathering may have played a significant role in the development of early classification systems in the human mind, encouraging the ability to distinguish categories based on subtle differences. Others remain cautious about projecting modern cognitive structures onto prehistoric behavior. The group continues moving slowly through the area, leaving minimal disturbance behind. Nothing is taken without observation. Nothing is rushed. Even rest feels temporary, like a pause between moments of necessary awareness. You notice children nearby, mirroring adult behavior. They crouch, observe, and occasionally attempt small actions. Their learning is constant but indirect, absorbed through presence rather than instruction. A gentle comparison emerges. In your world today, knowledge is often separated into subjects and lessons. Here, knowledge is inseparable from survival itself. It is embedded in movement, in attention, in repeated interaction with the land. The wind shifts slightly through the trees, producing a soft rustling sound that blends with distant movement. The forest feels alive in a way that is not threatening, but deeply present. Every sound carries potential meaning. Scholars still debate whether early humans possessed detailed botanical knowledge comparable to modern ethnobotany, or whether their understanding was more general and opportunistic. The evidence supports both interpretations depending on region and climate conditions. You watch as the group gradually finishes gathering. Containers are filled slowly, never to excess. There is an unspoken balance between need and restraint, as if taking too much would disturb something larger than themselves. As they begin to move again, you realize how interconnected everything is here. Hunting, gathering, movement, observation. Nothing exists separately. Each action feeds into another, forming a continuous loop of survival and awareness. And as you walk with them out of the forest edge, carrying nothing but attention, you begin to understand that in this world, knowing where to step is just as important as knowing where to look. You leave the forest edge behind, and the world opens again into a wide, wind-touched expanse. The transition feels almost like breathing out after holding still for too long. The group moves with quiet purpose, carrying gathered materials in woven bundles and simple containers. Nothing is heavy in appearance, but everything feels valuable, as if even the smallest root or branch has been carefully chosen for a reason. Archaeological evidence from the Upper Paleolithic shows that humans commonly built temporary shelters using a combination of wood, bone, and animal hides. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by post-hole patterns, hearth remnants, and preserved structural fragments found at various excavation sites across Eurasia. These shelters were not random piles of material, but carefully arranged structures designed for insulation and portability. You notice the group beginning to slow as they approach a slightly raised area of ground. It is not dramatic, just enough elevation to reduce wind exposure. People begin to separate into familiar roles without discussion. Some gather materials, others prepare the ground, and a few tend to the children who remain close. A lesser-known archaeological detail is that repeated occupation layers at certain prehistoric sites show that groups often rebuilt shelters in nearly identical configurations, suggesting a strong memory of spatial organization and possibly shared architectural knowledge passed across generations. You crouch and watch as the first framework begins to take shape. Long wooden branches are placed into the ground at angles, forming a loose dome-like structure. The movements are efficient, almost practiced. There is no hesitation, only coordination built from repetition. Scholars remain divided on whether early humans had standardized shelter designs, or whether construction methods varied significantly between groups and environments. Some researchers argue that similarities across regions suggest shared cultural patterns, while others believe practical environmental constraints naturally led to similar outcomes. You notice how stones are arranged around the base, not randomly, but in a way that suggests both stability and function. They may hold down hides, or help define the shelter boundary. Everything serves more than one purpose. A quirky observation from experimental archaeology is that when researchers attempt to reconstruct prehistoric shelters, they often discover that small adjustments in angle or material tension dramatically affect warmth retention, highlighting how precise this seemingly simple construction actually is. You begin to feel how important shelter is in this environment. It is not just protection from weather, it is a center of rest, storage, social interaction, and safety. Without it, every moment outside would carry constant exposure to wind, cold, and unpredictability. As the structure grows, animal hides are brought forward. They are heavy but flexible, carefully treated to withstand cold and moisture. The texture is rough and organic, carrying the faint scent of smoke and earth. When placed over the frame, the shelter begins to take its final shape. One widely accepted archaeological interpretation is that mobile shelters played a crucial role in allowing early humans to expand into colder regions of the world, including Ice Age environments that would otherwise be uninhabitable. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by settlement distribution and climate adaptation studies. You notice a brief pause in activity as everyone adjusts the hides together. There is a moment of collective alignment, as if the structure itself requires shared agreement before it becomes complete. Then, slowly, the shelter settles into place. Inside, the space is small but intentional. It is not meant for openness, but for containment of warmth. You step closer and feel the temperature difference immediately. Even without fire, the interior holds a softer air. A gentle comparison comes to mind. In modern life, buildings are often permanent, fixed structures that define cities and landscapes. Here, shelter is temporary, flexible, and shaped by movement rather than permanence. It exists to support life on the move, not to stop it. You notice that the group does not treat the shelter as finished in a final sense. Instead, it is adjusted continuously. Hides are tightened, edges are reinforced, and interior spaces are arranged according to need rather than design. Some researchers suggest that the flexibility of prehistoric shelters reflects a broader cognitive adaptability in early humans, where problem-solving was immediate and situational rather than based on fixed plans. Others argue that repeated patterns in shelter construction indicate more structured knowledge than often assumed. Children move in and out of the structure, testing its edges, observing how adults work, occasionally helping by carrying small materials. Their learning remains embedded in participation, not instruction. The wind passes over the shelter, pressing gently against its surface. The structure responds slightly but holds firm. It is alive in a subtle way, interacting constantly with the environment around it. You sit near the entrance and observe the rhythm of construction slowly turning into stillness. Tasks are finishing, tools are being set aside, and movement begins to settle into rest. A small detail catches your attention. Someone places a bundle of dried grass inside, not as decoration, but likely as insulation or bedding. Even comfort here is functional, tied directly to survival efficiency. Scholars still debate whether prehistoric groups differentiated interior spaces for specific purposes such as sleeping, tool storage, or social gathering, or whether these spaces were used fluidly depending on immediate need. As the shelter becomes quieter, you realize how quickly it transformed from an open framework into a shared living space. It did not require permanence to feel real. It only required use. The group begins to settle around it, some resting nearby, others continuing small tasks. The shelter now feels like a pause in motion rather than an end point, and as you remain there, watching the structure hold warmth against the cold world outside, you begin to understand that for these early humans, home is not a place they stay. It is a place they can rebuild wherever survival leads them. You stay near the shelter as the light begins to shift again, marking the slow passage of time in a world without clocks. The fire outside has been rekindled, smaller now, more controlled, as if the group is carefully balancing warmth with fuel preservation. Smoke rises in thin lines, dissolving into the cold air above the camp. In the Upper Paleolithic world, seasonal rhythm shaped nearly every aspect of human behavior. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by environmental archaeology and climate data reconstructed from ice cores and sediment layers. Humans were not simply reacting to weather day by day, but responding to long cycles of resource availability and migration patterns that defined survival. You notice that the group's activity is becoming more structured around the shelter. Some individuals remain inside, resting or organizing materials, while others move outward in short, purposeful trips. The shelter now functions as a central point, a temporary anchor in an otherwise shifting landscape. A lesser-known archaeological insight is that some prehistoric sites show evidence of repeated social clustering, where certain individuals consistently appear in association with specific activity areas, suggesting early forms of social organization or habitual role association within groups. You watch as an older individual sits slightly apart from the others near the fire. Their posture is relaxed but attentive. People occasionally approach them, not with urgency, but with quiet gestures, as if seeking acknowledgement or shared understanding before continuing their tasks. Scholars remain divided on whether such figures represent early forms of leadership or simply respected knowledge holders, whose influence came from experience rather than authority. Some interpretations emphasize egalitarian structures, while others suggest more subtle hierarchies may have existed. Nearby, you notice someone repairing a tool. A stone blade is being reattached to a wooden handle using plant fibers and resin. The process is slow and deliberate. Each movement is careful, as if precision matters more than speed. One quirky detail from experimental archaeology is that prehistoric adhesives made from natural resins and fats can, under the right conditions, be surprisingly strong and durable, sometimes outperforming modern synthetic attempts when applied with traditional methods. You crouch closer and observe the repair work. There is no wasted motion. Every step builds on the last. Preparation of materials, alignment of edges, securing of bindings. It feels almost ritualized, though it is purely practical. A widely accepted archaeological interpretation is that composite tools like these represent a significant cognitive leap in human evolution, demonstrating the ability to plan multiple steps ahead and combine different materials for a single functional purpose. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by tool typology studies across multiple regions. You begin to see how much knowledge is embedded in even the simplest object here. A blade is not just a blade. It is stone, wood, fiber, resin, and memory of how to assemble them correctly. The wind shifts slightly, brushing through the camp. People respond almost unconsciously, adjusting their positions, tightening hides, or moving closer to the shelter. There is no disruption, only adaptation. In modern life, tools are often purchased complete and ready to use. Here, every tool is also a process, requiring knowledge of materials, environment, and timing. Nothing exists fully separate from its creation. You notice a small group preparing to leave the camp. They move quietly, collecting minimal supplies. Their departure is not announced, but it is understood. Movement is constant in this world, and staying still is always temporary. Some researchers suggest that mobility patterns like these may have included not only resource gathering, but also social connections between different groups, allowing exchange of materials, ideas, and possibly even cultural practices. Others argue that evidence for such interaction is limited and difficult to interpret conclusively. A gentle comparison comes to mind. In your world today, travel is often planned and scheduled. Here, it is responsive, shaped by immediate conditions rather than fixed timelines. You watch as the departing group disappears into the landscape, becoming part of the distance almost immediately. There is no clear boundary between leaving and being gone. The environment absorbs movement quickly. Back near the fire, activity continues steadily. Food is prepared in small portions. Tools are checked and adjusted, conversation, still non-verbal, flows through gesture and proximity. A small detail draws your attention. A piece of decorated material, possibly bone or stone, is passed briefly between two individuals before being placed back into a container. It is not clear whether it is symbolic or practical, but it is treated with care. Scholars still debate whether such decorated objects represent early symbolic systems, personal identity markers, or simply aesthetic experimentation without deeper meaning. The evidence allows multiple interpretations, and no single explanation is universally accepted. You sit quietly at the edge of the camp, watching how everything moves without urgency yet without pause. There is a rhythm here that feels neither fast nor slow, but perfectly aligned with necessity. The shelter behind you holds warmth, the fire holds light, the people hold knowledge in motion. Nothing is separate and nothing is fixed. And as you remain in this moment, you begin to understand that survival here is not defined by progress or permanence, but by the ability to stay in balance with a world that is always changing. You remain at the edge of the camp as the day settles into a quieter rhythm. The fire has stabilized into a steady core of heat, and the shelter behind you now feels like part of the landscape itself, almost as if it has always been here. People move in and out of its opening without ceremony, carrying small bundles, adjusting hides, or simply pausing to sit near the warmth for a moment before continuing their tasks. Life in the Upper Paleolithic was deeply structured by environmental unpredictability. This is a widely established conclusion in archaeology, drawn from pollen analysis, faunal remains, and long-term climate reconstructions. Human groups did not experience time as fixed or linear in the modern sense, but as cycles of availability, scarcity, movement, and return. You notice how the group reacts to subtle changes in the wind. When it strengthens, people shift closer to sheltered areas. When it softens, activity spreads outward again. There is no announcement, no instruction. Everything is read through sensation and shared awareness. A lesser-known archaeological observation is that many prehistoric camps show evidence of flexible spatial organization, where activity zones such as food preparation, tool making, and resting areas shift over time rather than remaining fixed in place. You watch as someone drags a bundle of branches closer to the fire. Another person reorganizes stones around the hearth, adjusting the shape slightly. These small changes are not decorative. They influence airflow, heat distribution, and safety. Scholars remain divided on whether such spatial arrangements were consciously designed or gradually emerged through repeated habit. Some argue for intentional environmental engineering, while others suggest practical adaptation naturally produced similar patterns. Nearby, you see children sitting together, quietly observing adults. One of them imitates a tool sharpening motion using a stick and stone. There is no correction, only occasional glances of approval or continued attention from older members of the group. A quirky detail from experimental archaeology is that when researchers recreate stone tool production, they often find that even slight variations in grip or angle can significantly change the outcome, suggesting that prehistoric skill acquisition required long periods of observation and practice. You crouch near a tool-making area. Stone fragments are scattered on the ground, some sharp enough to reflect light. An individual selects a coarse stone and begins striking it with controlled force. Each strike produces a distinct sound, sharp and precise, followed by a brief pause to assess the result. You begin to understand how much patience is embedded in this process. Nothing is rushed. Every tool is the result of accumulated attention, not just effort. One widely accepted archaeological interpretation is that the development of advanced lithic technologies during this period reflects increasing cognitive planning abilities in early humans. This is a mainstream historical fact, supported by progressive complexity in tool assemblage across multiple excavation layers. You notice how others occasionally pause to watch the toolmaker. This is not interruption, but learning in progress. Observation is part of production, and production is part of education. The wind carries faint scents across the camp. Smoke, damp earth, animal hide, and something faintly metallic from freshly struck stone. These sensory layers form a constant background that defines daily life here. In modern environments, many of these sensory cues are removed or filtered. Here, they are essential signals that help orient attention and behavior. A small interaction catches your eye. One person offers a newly shaped tool to another. The exchange is brief, but careful. The recipient tests the edge, nods slightly, and returns it with a subtle gesture of acknowledgement. Some researchers propose that such exchanges may represent early forms of social valuation systems, where tools and materials carried both practical and social significance. However, other interpretations suggest these interactions were purely functional without symbolic meaning. You notice how the group naturally clusters and disperses throughout the day. There is no rigid structure, yet there is clear organization. People seem to know where they are needed without being told. A gentle comparison emerges. In modern life, organization often relies on schedules, roles, and explicit instructions. Here, coordination emerges through awareness, repetition, and shared experience. The shelter behind you creaks slightly in the wind, but remains stable. Someone adjusts a section of hide without prompting, reinforcing it against the changing air. Maintenance is continuous, not scheduled. Scholars still debate whether early human groups developed proto-territorial behaviors around campsites, or whether these spaces remained fluid and shared among multiple groups depending on season and resource availability. Evidence from site overlap patterns supports multiple interpretations. You sit for a moment near the fire again, feeling its steady presence. It does not dominate the environment, it integrates with it, shaping activity without forcing it. The day continues in this quiet balance. Small actions, repeated attention, constant adjustment. Nothing fixed, everything responsive. And as you observe the camp moving through its routine, you begin to realize that stability here does not come from permanence, but from the ability to continually adapt without breaking the rhythm of life itself. You notice the light shifting again, slowly tilting toward a softer angle as the day moves forward. Shadows lengthen across the camp, stretching between the shelter, the fire, and the scattered work areas like quiet threads connecting everything together. The group continues its steady rhythm of activity, but there is a subtle change in pace now, as if the energy of the morning is beginning to settle into something more reflective. During the Upper Paleolithic period, childhood was not separated from adult life in the way it often is today. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by ethnographic comparison with modern hunter-gatherer societies and supported indirectly by wear patterns on small tools that appear sized for younger hands. Children were integrated into daily survival activities from an early age, learning through participation rather than formal instruction. You watch a group of children moving near the edge of the camp. They are not isolated or supervised in a strict sense, but they remain close to adults, mirroring their actions in small, imperfect ways. One child attempts to mimic the motion of scraping a hide, while another gathers small sticks and places them in a loose pile near the fire. A lesser-known archaeological observation is that some prehistoric sites contain miniature tools or simplified implements, which researchers interpret as possible evidence of early learning stages or training objects for younger members of the group. Nearby, an adult pauses to observe the children briefly. There is no correction in words, only a subtle adjustment of posture or demonstration of a movement repeated slowly, as if allowing understanding to form naturally through observation. Scholars remain divided on whether prehistoric education was intentionally structured, or whether skill transmission occurred entirely through immersion and imitation. Some argue that repeated consistency in tool production suggests deliberate teaching, while others believe that necessity alone would have produced similar learning outcomes. You shift your attention toward the center of the camp, where food preparation is taking place again. Small portions are being divided carefully. The process is unhurried, but precise, as if fairness and efficiency are both understood without being spoken. A quirky detail from experimental archaeology is that when researchers attempt to reconstruct prehistoric food-sharing practices, they often find that division based purely on eye estimation tends to produce surprisingly consistent portions over time, suggesting that early humans may have developed strong intuitive measurement skills. You notice how distribution is not centralized. There is no single person assigning portions. Instead, food moves through the group in a fluid pattern, guided by need, presence, and subtle acknowledgement. One widely accepted archaeological interpretation is that food sharing played a crucial role in strengthening social cohesion among early human groups, ensuring survival during periods of scarcity. This is a mainstream historical fact, supported by isotopic evidence and analysis of communal living patterns at excavation sites. You crouch slightly and observe how individuals respond when receiving food. There is no rush, no accumulation. Items are accepted, sometimes shared onward, sometimes set aside, always with awareness of others nearby. The wind shifts again, carrying with it the mixed scent of smoke and raw earth. The camp feels enclosed yet open at the same time, as if it exists in a pocket of space defined not by walls, but by shared presence. A small interaction draws your attention. Two individuals exchange a set of gestures while standing near a tool bundle. One gestures toward the ground, then toward the horizon. The other responds with a slight tilt of the head and adjusts the bundle's position before moving away. Some researchers suggest that such exchanges may reflect early forms of planning communication, where gestures carry temporal meaning related to future movement or action. However, other interpretations caution against assuming structured linguistic intent from behavioral observation alone. You begin to notice how attention is constantly distributed across the camp. No one appears idle in the modern sense. Even stillness carries awareness. Sitting, watching, listening, adjusting small objects, all contribute to the functioning of the group. In modern life, productivity is often measured in visible output. Here, presence itself is productive. Awareness is an active state, not a passive one. A gentle comparison comes to mind. In your world, children often learn in separate spaces from adults. Here, learning happens everywhere at once, embedded in every action and every shared moment. The shelter creaks softly as the wind presses against it again. Someone inside adjusts the hides, tightening them against the cooling air. The structure responds subtly, holding warmth within its woven frame. Scholars still debate whether such integrated living arrangements influence cognitive development, potentially supporting stronger observational learning and memory skills due to constant environmental engagement. As the afternoon deepens, the camp feels increasingly cohesive. Movements slow slightly, but never stop. Conversations remain silent but continuous, expressed through gesture, proximity, and shared rhythm. You realize that time here does not feel divided into segments. It flows as a continuous experience shaped by attention and necessity rather than measurement, and as you remain among them, quietly observing the flow of daily life, you begin to understand that survival is not only about skill or strength, but about growing up inside a world where everything you see is also something you must learn from. You move with the group as they gradually leave the immediate comfort of the camp and spread into the surrounding landscape again. The shelter and fire remain behind as distant points of warmth, slowly shrinking into the background until they feel more like memory than physical place. Ahead of you, the land opens into a quieter, more uncertain space where every step feels like an act of reading the world. During the Upper Paleolithic, humans relied heavily on knowledge of seasonal migration routes for both animals and resources. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by archaeological distribution of tools and animal remains across wide regions. These patterns show that early humans were not randomly wandering, but following deeply understood environmental cycles that repeated over generations. You notice how confidently the group moves despite the lack of obvious landmarks. There are no signs or markers, yet their direction feels certain. Occasionally, someone pauses, looks at the ground, then adjusts their path slightly as if correcting an invisible map only they can see. A lesser-known archaeological observation is that repeated site alignment along natural corridors such as river valleys and ridgelines suggests early humans may have developed highly detailed mental mapping systems based on landscape memory rather than fixed physical routes. The ground beneath you changes texture as you walk. Soft soil gives way to compacted earth, then to patches of stone worn smooth by time and weather. Each variation seems to carry meaning for those who know how to interpret it. Scholars remain divided on whether prehistoric navigation was primarily instinctive or whether it involved structured cognitive mapping passed through social learning. Some researchers argue that consistent long-distance movement patterns indicate advanced spatial memory, while others believe these behaviors emerged gradually through repeated exploration. You notice one individual stepping slightly ahead, scanning the horizon with slow, deliberate movements. Others adjust their spacing in response, maintaining balance without spoken instruction. It feels like a system that regulates itself naturally. A quirky detail from experimental archaeology is that when modern participants are placed in unfamiliar natural environments without tools or maps, they often begin to develop improvised navigation strategies remarkably similar to those inferred from prehistoric behavior, including reliance on terrain slopes, wind direction, and sunlight angles. You begin to realize how many subtle environmental cues are being processed at once. The direction of wind, the openness of the sky, the distribution of vegetation, even the sound of distant movement all contribute to orientation. One widely accepted archaeological interpretation is that early human survival depended heavily on cognitive spatial awareness and environmental reading skills, allowing groups to move efficiently across vast territories without written guidance. This is a mainstream historical fact, supported by settlement patterns and resource tracking evidence. As you continue walking, the group slows near a slightly elevated ridge. From here, the landscape expands in all directions, offering a wide view of plains, scattered tree clusters, and distant movement that is difficult to distinguish clearly. You notice how everyone briefly becomes still, not resting, but observing. Heads turn slowly, attention spreads outward. It feels like the entire group is listening with their eyes. A small exchange of gestures follows. One person points toward a distant area, then lowers their hand. Another responds with a slight shift in stance, and the group subtly adjusts direction once more. Some researchers suggest that such coordinated decision-making without verbal instruction indicates highly developed shared mental models within early human groups. However, others argue that these interpretations may overstate cognitive complexity based on limited behavioral evidence. You crouch slightly and examine the ground again. Faint impressions appear here, possibly older tracks partially erased by wind. They are not fresh, but they still carry information for those who can read them. The group does not linger long. Movement resumes, but now with a slightly altered direction. There is no discussion, only alignment. In modern life, navigation is often externalized through technology. Here, it is internal, distributed across memory, perception, and shared attention. A gentle comparison emerges as you walk. Today, people often travel without needing to notice the ground beneath them. Here, the ground itself is constantly speaking. The wind grows slightly stronger as you descend from the ridge. Grass bends in slow waves, and the sound of movement becomes more noticeable. Somewhere in the distance, animals shift across the terrain, though they remain out of sight. Scholars still debate whether prehistoric groups maintained shared territorial knowledge across generations, or whether land use patterns were continuously rediscovered through experience. Evidence supports elements of both interpretations depending on region and climate stability. You realize that every step taken by the group is both practical and informational. Movement is not only about reaching a destination, but about updating understanding of the environment in real time. As the group continues forward, the distant camp is now completely out of view, yet its presence still feels connected, as if it exists not behind you, but as part of a larger network of movement and return. And as you walk through this vast open world with them, you begin to understand that navigation here is not about knowing where you're going in advance, but about continuously learning where you are as you move. You continue across the open terrain as the group gradually slow again, not because the journey is ending, but because attention is being redirected. The landscape here feels more layered, less like a single, continuous field, and more like a patchwork of small environments stitched together by wind and time. Low grasses bend in uneven directions, and scattered stones break the surface like quiet markers of forgotten movement. Research into Upper Paleolithic life strongly supports the idea that symbolic thinking was already emerging in human behaviour during this era. This is a mainstream historical fact grounded in archaeological discoveries such as carved objects, pigment use, and early decorative patterns found across multiple continents. These traces suggest that meaning was beginning to exist beyond immediate survival needs. You notice the group becoming more focused on specific points in the landscape. Instead of moving steadily forward, they pause more often, observing small details that would be easy to overlook. A change in soil colour, a cluster of stones, or a subtle shift in vegetation density seems to carry importance. A lesser-known archaeological observation is that some prehistoric sites show concentrated deposits of pigments like ochre in areas not directly related to tool production or food processing, suggesting possible non-practical uses such as marking, identification, or group-based expression. You crouch near a flat stone where faint traces of red pigment are visible, partially faded by time and weather. It is not clear what shape or pattern it once formed, but the intentionality of its placement feels undeniable. Scholars remain divided on whether early symbolic behaviour was primarily ritualistic, communicative, or simply exploratory in nature. Some researchers interpret these markings as early expressions of identity or belief systems, while others caution that assigning meaning may project modern assumptions onto ancient actions. Nearby, you observe someone carefully rubbing pigment between stones, creating a fine powder. The process is slow and deliberate, almost meditative. The resulting colour is deep and earthy, standing out sharply against the pale environment. A quirky detail from experimental archaeology is that when researchers recreate pigment processing using prehistoric techniques, they often find that the textures and shades produced vary significantly depending on stone type and grinding pressure, indicating a high level of material sensitivity in ancient practices. You begin to see that this is not random activity. It is focused, repeated, and treated with care. The group seems to understand that these materials hold significance beyond their physical properties. One widely accepted archaeological interpretation is that the use of pigments and decorative materials during the Upper Paleolithic reflects the development of abstract thinking and social signalling systems. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by widespread distribution of pigment use across distant prehistoric populations. You notice small items being passed between individuals. Some appear to be decorated stones or bones, while others are simple objects that have been altered in some way. Each exchange is brief but intentional, accompanied by subtle gestures. The wind moves through the area, carrying fine dust and the faint scent of earth. Everything feels still yet active at the same time, as if the environment itself is participating in observation. A gentle comparison comes to mind. In modern life, meaning is often stored in written language or digital symbols. Here, meaning is embedded in physical objects, gestures, and shared recognition of their significance. You watch as a small group gathers around a slightly raised surface. One individual traces a faint line in the soil using a stick, then steps back. Others observe quietly before responding with small adjustments or additional marks. Some researchers suggest that such markings may represent early forms of spatial communication or group memory systems, though others argue that without clear repetition patterns, it is difficult to distinguish intentional symbolism from casual activity. You notice how carefully everyone treats the marked surface. There is no disturbance, only observation and response. Even movement around it feels restrained, as if the space itself requires respect. The surrounding landscape remains open, but this area feels different, not enclosed, but focused. Attention is concentrated here in a way that is difficult to ignore. Scholars still debate whether symbolic behavior in early human groups emerged suddenly as part of cognitive evolution, or gradually through accumulated practical actions that slowly gained additional meaning over time. You realize that nothing here is separate from observation. Even silence carries information. Even stillness feels intentional. As the group begins to shift again, the marked area is left behind without disruption, as if its purpose has been acknowledged but not fully defined. It remains in the landscape, waiting for future interpretation or return. And as you move forward with them once more, you begin to understand that in this world, meaning is not fixed in explanation. It is carried in objects, repeated in gestures, and slowly built through shared attention over time. You move away from the marked ground and follow the group as the terrain begins to shift once again. The openness of the plains gives way to a more fragmented landscape, where low rises and scattered vegetation create pockets of partial visibility. Nothing is fully hidden here, yet nothing is fully revealed either, as if the world is intentionally withholding clarity. During the Upper Paleolithic, early humans began to show increasing evidence of cognitive complexity that extended beyond immediate survival tasks. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by archaeological findings such as carved figurines, engraved bones, and the controlled use of fire in structured spaces. These developments suggest that human thought was beginning to include memory, symbolism, and possibly early forms of belief. You notice that the group's attention is no longer focused on gathering or movement alone. There's a different kind of awareness emerging, one that seems to respond to patterns in the environment rather than immediate physical needs. People pause more often, looking at distant shapes, listening longer to subtle sounds, and adjusting their behavior based on things that are not directly visible. A lesser-known archaeological observation is that some Upper Paleolithic sites contain repeated arrangements of objects that do not appear to serve direct practical functions, leading researchers to propose early forms of spatial organization that may have carried social or symbolic meaning. You crouch near a small cluster of stones arranged in a loose circular pattern. There is no obvious utility to it, yet its placement feels deliberate. The stones are not identical in size, and their spacing suggests attention rather than randomness. Scholars remain divided on whether such arrangements represent ritual behavior, early symbolic communication, or simply practical activities that gained additional meaning through repetition. Some interpretations emphasize emerging spirituality, while others argue that caution is needed before assigning abstract intent. Nearby, you observe individuals moving more slowly, almost cautiously, as they approach certain areas. There is a sense that not all spaces are treated equally. Some are entered freely, while others are approached with visible restraint. A quirky detail from experimental archaeology is that when modern participants are asked to replicate prehistoric object arrangements without instructions, they often naturally create patterns such as circles or lines, suggesting that certain spatial organizations may emerge from basic human perception tendencies. You begin to sense that the environment here is not just physically navigated, but mentally mapped with layers of significance. Some places feel ordinary, while others feel marked by repeated attention, even if their exact meaning is unclear. One widely accepted archaeological interpretation is that the emergence of symbolic spatial behavior during this period reflects a growing capacity for abstract representation in human cognition. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by comparative studies of material culture across multiple prehistoric regions. You notice a subtle interaction between two individuals near a flat stretch of ground. One traces a faint arc in the soil with a stick, then steps back. The other watches closely, then adjusts the mark slightly before both pause as if evaluating the result. The wind moves gently across the area, brushing low grass and carrying faint dust into the air. The marks on the ground remain visible for a moment before slowly fading at the edges. A gentle comparison comes to mind. In modern life, meaning is often recorded in permanent systems such as writing or digital storage. Here, meaning exists in more fragile forms, constantly shaped and reshaped by interaction and environment. You continue walking with the group as the landscape becomes more uneven. Small depressions in the ground collect shadows, and raised areas catch the light differently. Everything feels subtly layered, as if the land itself has memory. Some researchers suggest that early humans may have used repeated environmental engagement to build shared cognitive maps, allowing groups to develop collective understanding of significant locations. Others remain cautious, arguing that such interpretations may exceed what the physical evidence can reliably support. You notice that movement is now slower, more deliberate. People are not just travelling through space, but observing it continuously. Every pause feels like a moment of interpretation. Scholars still debate whether early symbolic landscapes were intentionally constructed to convey meaning, or whether meaning gradually emerged from repeated use and human perception of natural features. As you move forward, the marked stone area is no longer visible, but its presence still feels connected to the group's awareness, as if it has been absorbed into shared memory rather than left behind. And as you continue through this shifting terrain, you begin to understand that in this world, meaning does not stay in one place. It moves with people, settles briefly in objects or locations, and then lives on in memory and repeated attention. You follow the group as the land begins to feel heavier, almost as if the air itself is carrying more tension than before. The open patterns of grass and stone gradually give way to a landscape where visibility shortens and sound feels closer, more concentrated. Even your footsteps seem quieter here, absorbed by uneven ground and scattered patches of soft earth. In the Upper Paleolithic world, encounters with large predators were a constant but unpredictable part of life. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by fossil evidence, cut marks on bones, and predator remains found near human habitation sites. Humans did not dominate this environment through strength alone, but through awareness, cooperation, and careful avoidance strategies. You notice the group slowing almost instinctively. No one speaks, yet everyone becomes more alert. Movements tighten, spacing between individuals becomes more deliberate. It feels like the entire group is listening to the environment at once. A lesser-known archaeological observation is that in some prehistoric sites, animal bones show patterns suggesting not only hunting activity, but also scavenging behaviour, indicating that early humans may have shared ecological roles with other large predators rather than occupying a strictly dominant position. You crouch slightly as the group shifts behind a low rise in the terrain. From here, the world ahead is partially visible. You cannot see a specific threat, but the behaviour of the group suggests that something is being carefully avoided rather than directly confronted. Scholars remain divided on how frequently early human groups directly encountered large predators and whether avoidance or confrontation played a larger role in their survival strategies. Some interpretations emphasize stealth and caution, while others suggest opportunistic competition around shared resources. The wind changes subtly, and with it, the soundscape tightens. Distant movement in grass becomes more noticeable. Every rustle feels amplified, every pause more meaningful. The environment seems to demand heightened attention. A quirky detail from experimental archaeology is that modern researchers studying predator avoidance behavior in survival simulations often find that humans naturally adopt crouched movement and reduce sound patterns even without instruction, suggesting deeply ingrained instinctive responses. You observe how the group communicates now. Gestures are smaller, closer to the body. Eye contact becomes more frequent but brief. Everything is compressed into minimal signals that still carry clear meaning. One widely accepted archaeological interpretation is that early human survival in predator-rich environments strongly influenced the development of heightened sensory awareness and rapid group coordination. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by spatial analysis of habitation sites and predator fossil overlap patterns. You notice faint tracks in the ground ahead. They are not human. The group does not approach them directly. Instead, they shift direction slightly, maintaining distance while still moving forward. There is no fear expressed openly, but there is careful respect for what might be nearby. Survival here does not depend on dominance, but on timing and perception. A gentle comparison arises. In modern life, danger is often distant, categorized, and managed through systems. Here, it is immediate, environmental, and read through constant observation rather than separation. You remain low as the group moves through a narrow passage between uneven terrain. Vegetation becomes denser for a moment, reducing visibility. Every step feels intentional, as if even foot placement is being considered. Some researchers suggest that repeated exposure to predator-rich environments may have contributed to the evolution of advanced social coordination and communication systems in early humans. However, other scholars caution that direct causal links remain difficult to establish from available evidence. The group pauses again, this time longer. You feel the stillness deepen. Even distant sounds seem to fade, as if the world is temporarily holding its breath. Then, slowly, movement resumes, not hurried, not relaxed, but carefully balanced between both. The direction changes slightly once more, guiding everyone away from whatever lies ahead. You realize that no one has looked back. There is no need. Awareness is distributed across the group, and decisions are made collectively without explicit discussion. Scholars still debate whether early human groups relied more on learned environmental knowledge or instinctive behavioral patterns when avoiding predators, with evidence supporting elements of both depending on region and time period. As the terrain opens slightly again, the tension begins to ease. Movements become less compressed. Breathing feels more natural. The group does not celebrate the change, but it is clearly acknowledged through subtle relaxation. And as you continue walking with them, you begin to understand that in this world, survival is not about fighting every danger. It is about recognizing it early enough to move with the landscape rather than against it. You move out of the tense, compressed terrain and gradually feel the world widen again. The air becomes easier to breathe, as if the landscape itself has released its grip. The group does not rush, but their movements lose some of the tightness from before. The sense of unseen pressure slowly fades behind you, replaced by a quieter, steadier rhythm of travel. Archaeological research into Upper Paleolithic clothing practices shows that early humans used tailored animal hides to adapt to different climates, stitching and shaping them to improve warmth and mobility. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by preserved bone needles, hide processing tools, and wear patterns found on ancient garments. You notice how clothing here is not just protection, but adaptation. Hides are layered, tightened, and adjusted throughout the day depending on wind and temperature. Every adjustment is small, but it reflects constant attention to the environment. A lesser-known archaeological observation is that microscopic analysis of hide processing tools reveals traces of plant oils and animal fats, suggesting that early humans developed sophisticated methods for softening and preserving materials far earlier than once assumed. You watch someone stop briefly to tighten a strap on their clothing. The motion is practiced, almost automatic. Nearby, another individual shakes out a fur covering, allowing trapped cold air to escape before wrapping it again around their body. Scholars remain divided on how standardized prehistoric clothing production was across different regions. Some argue that shared techniques spread widely through cultural exchange, while others believe that similar environmental pressures independently produced comparable solutions. The group continues forward, now moving through a landscape that feels less threatening and more open again. The ground is uneven but stable, shaped by long cycles of wind and seasonal change. A quirky detail from experimental archaeology is that when researchers attempt to recreate prehistoric hide garments, they often find that comfort and durability depend heavily on subtle variations in stitching density and drying methods, indicating a high level of experiential knowledge. You begin to understand that clothing here is not static, it evolves constantly. Repairs are made in the field, adjustments happen during movement. Nothing is fixed in its final form. One widely accepted archaeological interpretation is that tailored clothing played a significant role in enabling human expansion into colder Ice Age regions by reducing heat loss and increasing survival range. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by environmental distribution models of early human settlement. You notice how the group distributes itself more evenly now that immediate danger has passed. Spacing relaxes slightly, but awareness remains high. Even in calm conditions, attention does not fully disappear. The wind carries a steady rhythm across the landscape, brushing through grass and low shrubs. The sound is soft but continuous, like a background pulse that never fully stops. A gentle comparison comes to mind. In modern life, clothing is often chosen for style or convenience. Here, it is a living system of survival, constantly adjusted to match shifting environmental conditions. You observe a small interaction where one person examines another's clothing briefly, then adjusts a loose edge without asking. The action is accepted without pause, suggesting that maintenance of equipment and clothing is a shared responsibility. Some researchers suggest that such collective maintenance behaviors may have strengthened group cohesion by reinforcing mutual dependency. However, other scholars argue that these actions may simply reflect practical necessity rather than social bonding mechanisms. The terrain begins to change again, this time becoming slightly more textured with patches of dry vegetation and exposed stone. Movement slows briefly as the group assesses the ground ahead. You notice faint impressions in the soil, not fresh tracks, but older marks partially softened by wind and time. They're observed briefly, then ignored, as if already understood and accounted for. Scholars still debate whether early human clothing styles carried regional identity markers, or whether functional demands erased most variation between groups living in similar climates. A small detail draws your attention. Someone carries a bundle of prepared hides, carefully folded and tied. It is not large, but it appears important, handled with more care than either materials. The group pauses for a moment near a slight rise in the terrain. From here, the view opens again, revealing distant landforms and shifting patterns of light across uneven ground. You feel a quiet transition happening, not a stop, but a soft recalibration of direction and pace. The group seems to be deciding something without words, using only observation and shared understanding. One quirky observation from experimental archaeology is that modern attempts to simulate prehistoric group decision-making often show that consensus can emerge surprisingly quickly when individuals share continuous environmental awareness rather than relying on verbal negotiation. The group begins moving again, slightly changing direction. There is no hesitation, only alignment. You realize that even without speech, there is a continuous flow of understanding shaping every step. Clothing, movement, terrain, and attention all work together in a single system of adaptation, and as you continue forward with them through the shifting landscape, you begin to see that survival here is not just about enduring the cold, but about constantly adjusting every small part of life to remain in harmony with it. You follow the group as the landscape gradually softens into a quieter stretch of terrain, where the wind feels less sharp and the ground holds sound in a different way. It is not silence, but something closer to absorption, as if the world is listening more than speaking. Movement continues steadily, but the urgency of earlier moments has fully dissolved. Research into Upper Paleolithic environments shows that early humans experienced a wide range of acoustic conditions depending on terrain, from echoing open plains to heavily dampened forest edges. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by experimental reconstructions and environmental modelling, which suggests that sound played a key role in spatial awareness and group coordination. You notice how the group reacts to even the smallest auditory changes. A shifting grass, a distant bird call, or the subtle crack of stone underfoot can briefly redirect attention. It feels like hearing is not just passive reception here, but active interpretation. A lesser-known archaeological observation is that cave sites containing early human occupation often show patterns of acoustic suitability, where chamber shapes amplify or soften sound in ways that may have influenced their use for gathering, communication, or shelter. You pause near a slight depression in the ground as the group spreads out gently. Some individuals move ahead, while others remain closer together. There is no fixed formation, but there is balance in spacing, like a shape constantly adjusting itself. Scholars remain divided on whether early humans intentionally selected locations based on acoustic properties, or whether such patterns are coincidental outcomes of sheltering in naturally favourable landscapes. Some researchers argue for perceptual awareness of sound environments, while others remain cautious about assigning deliberate selection. A faint breeze passes through, carrying layered sounds across the terrain. It is subtle, but you begin to notice how direction changes perception. Sounds from behind feel different from those ahead, even when similar in volume. You observe someone briefly stop and tilt their head, as if listening more carefully. After a moment, they gesture slightly, and the group adjusts direction again. No explanation is needed. The sound itself seems to carry meaning. A quirky detail from experimental archaeology is that when modern participants are placed in natural environments and asked to navigate without visual cues, they often rely heavily on subtle auditory differences. Even when they are not consciously aware of doing so, you begin to understand how deeply integrated perception is in this world. Sight, sound, movement, and memory are not separate systems but overlapping layers of awareness. One widely accepted archaeological interpretation is that early human survival strategies relied on multi-sensory environmental reading, allowing groups to interpret complex landscapes efficiently without technological aids. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by behavioral analysis and comparative anthropology. The group continues moving, now through a slightly more enclosed area where vegetation becomes denser again. The soundscape shifts immediately, becoming softer, more contained. You notice how footsteps change rhythm here. They become lighter almost instinctively. There is no instruction, but the group adapts together, as if sound reduction is an unspoken agreement. A gentle comparison comes to mind. In modern life, noise is often constant and backgrounded. Here, sound is information. It is not ignored but interpreted continuously. You see a small interaction ahead. One individual pauses, listens, then changes direction slightly. Another follows without question. The adjustment is minimal, but it feels significant, as if responding to something just beyond your perception. Some researchers suggest that heightened auditory awareness may have played an important role in early human communication development. while others argue that environmental necessity alone can explain these sensitivities without invoking cognitive specialization. The terrain begins to open again, and the soundscape shifts with it. Distant movement becomes more noticeable once more. The group slows, not in caution, but in observation. You realize that attention here is always distributed across multiple senses. Nothing is fully isolated. Every signal is part of a larger field of interpretation. Scholars still debate whether early humans developed shared environmental perception frameworks, or whether coordination simply emerged from repeated exposure to similar conditions over time. A small detail draws your attention. Someone briefly taps a stone against another, producing a short sound. It is not random. Others glance toward the direction of the sound, then continue moving. You feel how communication here is layered, not limited to gestures or sight. Sound itself becomes part of shared understanding. The group continues forward at steady pace, now moving through a space that feels neither enclosed nor fully open. It is transitional, shaped by changing terrain and shifting wind patterns. And as you walk with them, you begin to understand that in this world, listening is not just about hearing. It is about recognizing what the environment is saying before it becomes obvious. You continue moving with the group as the terrain gradually broadens again, opening into a wide transitional space where grasslands and scattered stone patches blend into one another. The light feels softer here, less obstructed, and the wind carries a steady rhythm that seems to move through everything at once. The group's pace becomes more coordinated again, as if the environment has returned to a familiar balance. Archaeological studies of Upper Paleolithic hunting practices indicate that cooperation between individuals was essential for securing large game in open environments. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by butchery marks on animal bones and spatial analysis of kill sites, which consistently show coordinated activity rather than solitary action. You notice how the group subtly reorganizes itself as the terrain changes. Spacing becomes more structured, with individuals drifting into positions that feel intentional even without verbal instruction. Some move slightly ahead, others remain behind, and a few stay at the edges, scanning the surroundings continuously. A lesser-known archaeological observation is that repeated patterns of tool distribution at hunting sites suggest that specific roles may have existed during group activities, including individuals responsible for tracking, driving, or processing resources after a successful hunt. You crouch briefly as the group slows near a stretch of uneven ground. Someone examines the soil carefully, then signals with a small gesture. The group adjusts direction slightly, not dramatically, but enough to reflect shared understanding of what lies ahead. Scholars remain divided on whether such coordinated behavior reflects early structured role specialization, or whether roles emerge dynamically in response to immediate environmental conditions. Some researchers see evidence of early social organization, while others interpret it as flexible improvisation. A quirky detail from experimental archaeology is that when modern participants are placed in group survival simulations, they often spontaneously develop consistent role patterns within a short period, even without instruction, suggesting that human cooperation may naturally organize itself under shared pressure. You begin to notice how attention in the group is distributed like a network. No single person appears to control direction. Instead, decisions seem to emerge from collective awareness, shaped by continuous observation and subtle cues. The wind shifts again, and the soundscape changes with it. Distant movement becomes more pronounced, and the group briefly slows. There is no visible tension, only heightened attention. One widely accepted archaeological interpretation is that cooperative hunting strategies were a major factor in the success of early human populations expanding into diverse environments. This is a mainstream historical fact, supported by spatial clustering of remains and repeated evidence of coordinated processing sites. You observe a moment of stillness as the group assesses the surroundings. Heads turn slowly, eyes scan the horizon. Then movement resumes in a slightly altered formation. In modern life, coordination often relies on explicit communication and planning tools. Here, coordination emerges continuously through shared perception and immediate response to environmental signals. You notice how quietly the group moves even when spread across a wider area. Footsteps are controlled, gestures are minimal, even breathing seems aligned with the surrounding quiet. Some researchers suggest that such highly coordinated movement patterns may have contributed to the development of advanced social cognition, while others argue that environmental necessity alone could account for these behaviors without requiring additional cognitive explanations. A small detail draws your attention. One individual briefly kneels, examining a broken branch and nearby impressions in the soil. After a short pause, they rise and adjust the group's direction with a subtle gesture. The group follows without hesitation. There is no discussion, only recognition. Scholars still debate whether early human hunting coordination relied more on learned shared strategies or on flexible real-time adaptation shaped by immediate environmental feedback. You begin to understand that what appears as silence here is actually continuous communication. It is expressed through posture, spacing, timing, and attention rather than words. The terrain begins to shift again, becoming slightly more open. The group relaxes marginally, though awareness never fully drops. Movement becomes smoother, less compressed, and as you continue with them through this wide and shifting landscape, you realize that cooperation here is not a single decision or event. It is a constant, living process that unfolds with every step taken together. You move deeper into the open landscape with the group, and the world begins to feel less tense, more expansive again. The ground is a mix of soft grass, scattered stones, and patches of earth that still hold the faint memory of earlier footsteps. The wind is steady but no longer sharp, and the rhythm of movement becomes calmer, almost rhythmic in its consistency. Evidence from Upper Paleolithic archaeological sites shows that food sharing was a central element of early human social life. This is a widely established conclusion based on isotopic analysis of skeletal remains and the distribution of animal bones across communal living spaces, which consistently indicate that resources were not consumed individually, but distributed among group members. You notice that the group gradually slows and begins to cluster in a loose formation. There is no single reason visible at first, but attention shifts toward a central activity where food is being divided. The process is quiet, deliberate, and deeply familiar to everyone present. A lesser-known archaeological observation is that wear patterns on ancient cutting tools often indicate repeated communal processing of animal carcasses, suggesting that food preparation was not only shared, but also highly organized across multiple individuals. You crouch slightly as you observe the distribution process. Portions are separated with care, not equal in a strict mathematical sense, but balanced according to presence, need, and familiarity within the group. There is an unspoken understanding guiding every movement. Scholars remain divided on whether early food-sharing systems were based primarily on kinship ties, or whether broader reciprocal networks existed that extended beyond immediate family groups. Some researchers argue for strong biological family structures, while others suggest more flexible social arrangements. A quirky detail from experimental archaeology is that when modern participants are placed in simulated prehistoric environments, they often begin to develop informal sharing systems within days, even without instructions, suggesting that cooperative food distribution may emerge naturally under survival conditions. You notice how receiving food is not a passive act. Each person acknowledges the exchange with subtle gestures or brief eye contact. Nothing is rushed, and nothing feels transactional in a modern sense. It is more like participation in a shared rhythm. One widely accepted archaeological interpretation is that communal food distribution played a crucial role in reducing survival risk by buffering individuals against unpredictable shortages. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by settlement patterns and nutritional evidence from prehistoric remains. You watch as a portion is passed to a younger individual, who accepts it quietly and moves slightly away to sit near the edge of the group. There is no separation between work, consumption, and rest. All of it exists in the same continuous space. The wind moves gently through the group, carrying faint scents of smoke, raw earth, and prepared food. The environment feels integrated into the activity rather than separate from it. You begin to realize how carefully attention is balanced here. No one appears distracted, yet no one is rigid either. Awareness flows through the group like a shared current. Some researchers suggest that food-sharing behaviors may have played a foundational role in the development of early social trust systems, while others argue that such interpretations risk projecting modern social theory onto prehistoric life without sufficient evidence. A small detail draws your focus. A piece of food is briefly held, inspected, then split again before being passed onward. The act is simple, but it reflects an underlying flexibility in how resources are handled. Scholars still debate whether prehistoric food sharing was primarily driven by survival necessity, or whether it also served to reinforce emerging social bonds and group identity. You notice how the group settles slightly after eating. Movements slow, but do not stop. Some individuals adjust clothing, others check tools, and a few simply sit in silence, observing the surroundings. In modern life, meals are often individual or scheduled, separated from the broader context of daily activity. Here, eating is embedded in the environment and the social structure at the same time. The landscape around you feels steady again, almost reassuring in its openness. Nothing is hidden, yet everything is still being watched carefully. And as you remain with them in this shared moment of quiet distribution and presence, you begin to understand that food here is not only sustenance, it is a form of connection that holds the group together through every changing landscape they move across. You remain with the group as the energy of the meal slowly settles into a calmer, more reflective rhythm. The immediate activity around food begins to fade, but nothing feels finished. Instead, the camp transitions into a quieter phase where attention shifts toward objects, small tasks, and subtle forms of expression that are easy to overlook if you are not paying close attention. Archaeological findings from the Upper Paleolithic period reveal that early humans frequently engaged in non-utilitarian forms of expression, including engravings, carved figurines, and patterned markings on bone or stone. This is a widely accepted conclusion in archaeology based on repeated discoveries across Europe and parts of Asia, suggesting that symbolic or expressive behavior was already well established long before written language existed. You notice a small group sitting slightly apart from the main activity area. They are not working on food or tools, yet their attention is focused on objects laid out in front of them. The atmosphere feels different here, more deliberate, as if observation itself has become the primary activity. A lesser-known archaeological observation is that some engraved objects from this period show repeated geometric patterns that do not appear to serve any direct functional purpose, leading researchers to propose that early humans may have engaged in structured visual experimentation or symbolic communication. You crouch closer and see a small piece of bone being carefully worked. Fine lines are etched into its surface using a pointed stone tool. The motion is slow and controlled. Each mark appears intentional, building upon the last in a pattern that is not immediately obvious but clearly not random. Scholars remain divided on whether such engravings represent early symbolic systems, personal expression, or simple byproducts of tool practice that gradually gained additional meaning through repetition and cultural context. Nearby, another individual holds a small object that has been shaped and smoothed over time. It is passed briefly between hands, examined from different angles, then placed back down with care. The handling suggests that its value is not purely practical. A quirky detail from experimental archaeology is that when researchers replicate prehistoric engraving techniques, they often find that maintaining consistent depth and spacing requires significant concentration and fine motor control, indicating that these activities were likely deliberate and skill-based rather than casual. You begin to understand that this quiet activity is not separate from survival, but exists alongside it. Even in a world defined by mobility and resource tracking, there is space for repetition, attention, and creation without immediate practical use. One widely accepted archaeological interpretation is that symbolic behavior during the Upper Paleolithic reflects an expanding capacity for abstract thought, allowing humans to represent ideas beyond immediate physical reality. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by the widespread appearance of symbolic artifacts across multiple regions. You observe how the group reacts to these objects. There is no ceremony, but there is attention. People lean in slightly, pause longer when looking, and sometimes exchange brief gestures before moving on. The wind passes gently through the camp, carrying faint traces of smoke and earth. The fire continues to burn steadily in the background, anchoring the space where all these activities take place. Some researchers suggest that early symbolic objects may have functioned as markers of identity, memory aids, or social signals, while others argue that their meanings were likely fluid and context-dependent rather than fixed. You notice a moment where two individuals examine the same engraved object together. One traces a line with a finger, then pauses. The other responds with a slight nod, and the object is placed carefully back among others. Scholars still debate whether symbolic expression in early human societies emerged as a sudden cognitive shift or developed gradually through repeated practical actions that slowly acquired cultural significance. You begin to see how this activity fits into the broader rhythm of the group. It is not separate from hunting, gathering, or movement. It is simply another way of engaging with the world, one that focuses on memory, pattern, and repetition. In modern life, creativity is often isolated into specific fields or activities. Here, it is embedded in daily existence, expressed through small, careful acts that may or may not have lasting meaning. The group slowly begins to shift again, not abandoning the objects, but leaving them in place as attention moves back toward movement and environment. Nothing is finalized, everything remains open, and as you continue observing them, you realize that even in a world defined by survival, there is space for curiosity, pattern-making, and quiet forms of expression that hint at something more than immediate necessity. You move with the group as they gradually leave behind the area of quiet object-making and symbolic markings. The landscape opens again, but this time it feels slightly different, as if the camp itself is not just a place but a moment that can be left and returned to repeatedly. The people do not look back for long. They simply adjust their direction and continue forward, as if the memory of the space remains with them even when it is no longer visible. Archaeological evidence from Upper Paleolithic sites shows repeated patterns of seasonal movement between resource zones, with groups returning to familiar areas over long cycles of time. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by settlement layering, tool distribution, and environmental data indicating predictable resource availability across different regions. You notice how effortlessly the group transitions between resting spaces and travel. There is no clear separation between home and journey. Everything exists as part of a continuous loop of movement, return, and reuse. A lesser-known archaeological observation is that some prehistoric sites contain overlapping occupation layers separated by long-time gaps, suggesting that early humans may have returned to the same locations across generations, building a kind of deep environmental memory. You walk across uneven ground where vegetation grows in scattered clusters. The group spreads out slightly, yet remains visually connected. Occasional gestures or pauses are enough to maintain coordination without needing closer proximity. Scholars remain divided on whether prehistoric groups actively planned long-term seasonal routes in a structured way, or whether these patterns emerged naturally from following resource availability year after year. Some researchers argue for early cognitive mapping traditions, while others emphasize adaptive repetition without formal planning. A quirky detail from experimental archaeology is that when modern participants are asked to navigate unfamiliar natural terrain repeatedly over time, they often begin to favor previously successful paths even without explicit instruction, suggesting that spatial memory and environmental preference can develop quickly through experience. You begin to understand how deeply memory is embedded in movement here. The landscape is not just observed in the present moment, it is remembered through repeated encounters, shaping future decisions without needing to be consciously recalled. One widely accepted archaeological interpretation is that seasonal mobility was a key adaptation that allowed early humans to survive in fluctuating Ice Age environments. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by ecological modelling and artifact distribution across wide geographic regions. You notice how certain members of the group seem more familiar with subtle changes in terrain. They pause briefly at specific points, then adjust direction slightly, guiding others without formal instruction. The wind carries across the open space, brushing through grass and low vegetation. It feels consistent, but not static. Even the wind seems to follow patterns that the group has learned to anticipate. Some researchers suggest that long-term seasonal movement may have contributed to the development of advanced spatial cognition in early humans, while others argue that environmental necessity alone can explain these behaviors without requiring additional cognitive specialization. You observe a moment where the group slows near a familiar-looking rise in the terrain. There is no announcement, but attention shifts collectively. People scan the surroundings with a quiet sense of recognition. Scholars still debate whether early humans developed shared mental maps of their environments, or whether knowledge of routes remained distributed and individually maintained within group members. You crouch slightly and notice faint traces of older movement in the soil. These impressions are not fresh, but they feel familiar in pattern, as if this path has been used before by the same group or others like them. The group does not linger long. Familiarity does not stop movement. It simply shapes direction. In modern life, travel often feels like reaching a destination that is separate from where you started. Here, movement feels cyclical, as if every journey is part of a larger repeating pattern, rather than a single linear path. A small interaction occurs near the front of the group. One individual pauses, looks ahead, then shifts slightly to the left. The others follow without hesitation. The adjustment is minimal, but it feels guided by recognition rather than instruction. You realize that knowledge of this landscape is not stored in maps or written records. It exists in bodies, in memory, and in repeated experience of place. And as you continue moving with them across this wide, familiar yet ever-changing terrain, you begin to understand that for these early humans, survival is not just about finding new places, but about remembering the old ones well enough to return at the right time. You continue moving through the familiar yet shifting landscape, and the rhythm of travel begins to feel almost meditative. The group is no longer navigating unfamiliar tension or intense focus. Instead, there is a steadier awareness, as if the land itself is now well understood underfoot. The terrain gently rises and falls, guiding movement without resistance, and the sky above feels wide and unchanged. Archaeological research into Upper Paleolithic settlement patterns shows a strong preference for locations near reliable water sources such as rivers, streams, and seasonal melt channels. This is a widely established conclusion based on excavation data and environmental reconstruction, which consistently links human occupation sites with access to fresh water. You notice how the group subtly adjusts its path toward a lower area of land. The movement is not explained or discussed, but it feels inevitable, as if everyone recognizes the importance of what lies ahead. The pace remains steady, neither hurried nor hesitant. A lesser-known archaeological observation is that many prehistoric camps show evidence of repeated proximity to water sources, even when alternative resources were available nearby, suggesting that water access may have influenced not only survival, but also social and spatial organization. You reach a shallow depression where the ground begins to soften slightly. Before long, the sound becomes noticeable. Water, not loud or rushing, but steady and continuous, shaping the space around it with a quiet persistence. Scholars remain divided on whether early human groups prioritized water sources primarily for practical survival needs, or whether these locations also held broader social or environmental significance beyond immediate utility. You crouch near the edge of the water as others begin to spread out along its length. Some kneel to drink, others inspect the flow, and a few begin filling simple containers made from hides or woven plant fibers. A quirky detail from experimental archaeology is that attempts to recreate prehistoric water carrying methods show that flexible containers made from treated hides can hold surprisingly large volumes while remaining lightweight, making them highly efficient for mobile groups. You watch the surface of the water closely. It reflects the sky in broken fragments, constantly shifting with movement and wind. Small ripples travel outward as people interact with it, yet the flow continues uninterrupted beneath. One widely accepted archaeological interpretation is that proximity to water sources played a critical role in determining long-term habitation zones during the Upper Paleolithic period. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by settlement clustering and ecological resource mapping. You notice how the group naturally organizes itself around the water without instruction. Some positions are closer, others slightly farther back, but all remain connected through shared activity and awareness. The wind is softer here, carrying a cooler, more humid feeling. It interacts with the surface of the water, creating small patterns that change constantly without repeating. A gentle comparison comes to mind. In modern life, water is often accessed instantly through infrastructure. Here, it is a place, a destination, and a shared focal point that structures movement and gathering. You observe a small interaction where one individual gestures toward a section of the water further upstream. Others look briefly in that direction before continuing their current task. There is no urgency, only awareness of variation in the environment. Some researchers suggest that water sites may have functioned as natural convergence points for different groups, potentially facilitating indirect contact or resource exchange. However, other interpretations remain cautious due to limited direct evidence for sustained interaction at these locations. You notice footprints along the muddy edge, overlapping in multiple directions. Some are recent, others softened by time. They suggest repeated visits, not just by this group, but possibly by others moving through the same region. Scholars still debate whether water sites in prehistoric environments served primarily as logistical hubs, or whether they also held social or symbolic importance in shaping group identity and interaction patterns. You sit for a moment and listen. The sound of water fills the space without dominating it. It blends with wind, movement, and distant animal calls, creating a layered environment of continuous presence. The group remains here longer than at previous stops, but nothing feels fixed. People continue to move, adjust, and prepare. The water is not a destination that ends travel. It is part of the ongoing cycle that defines it. And as you remain by the flowing edge with them, you begin to understand that in this world, water is not just a resource to be used. It is a point around which life organizes itself again and again across time and movement. You stay near the water a little longer as the group begins to settle into a calmer rhythm of activity. The sound of the stream remains steady in the background, almost like a constant companion that does not demand attention, but quietly shapes the atmosphere around it. People move in small, purposeful cycles between the water's edge and the surrounding land, never staying still for too long. Archaeological studies of Upper Paleolithic living sites often reveal strong associations between water sources and traces of smoke, ash, and organic remains, indicating repeated use of these areas for both practical and social activities. This is a widely accepted historical conclusion based on spatial patterning of artifacts and environmental evidence. You notice how the group uses the space differently here compared to previous locations. Some individuals remain close to the water for drinking and cleaning tools, while others move slightly farther back where the ground is drier. Preparing small tasks or resting briefly in the softer light. A lesser-known archaeological observation is that residue analysis on stone tools from riverside sites often shows mixed traces of plant and animal materials, suggesting that these locations were used for multiple overlapping activities rather than a single purpose. You crouch near a flat stone where someone is cleaning a tool. The motion is simple but careful. Water is poured over the blade, removing traces of material from earlier use. The process feels almost reflective, as if the tool is being reset for future tasks. Scholars remain divided on whether such multi-purpose use of riverbank spaces reflects planned spatial organization, or whether it emerged naturally from the convenience of access to water and resources in a single location. Nearby, you observe a small cluster of people sitting slightly apart from the main activity. They are not idle, but engaged in quieter tasks such as repairing equipment, adjusting containers, or simply observing the environment. A quirky detail from experimental archaeology is that when modern researchers replicate prehistoric riverbank activity zones, they often find that task overlap naturally forms distinct spatial patterns, even without instruction, suggesting that human activity may self-organize in shared environments. You begin to notice how sound behaves differently here. The water creates a constant acoustic layer that softens other noises, making movement feel less abrupt and more blended into the environment. One widely accepted archaeological interpretation is that proximity to water sources influence not only survival logistics, but also the spatial structure of daily life in early human groups. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by repeated excavation patterns showing clustered activity zones near rivers and lakes. You watch as someone fills a container and then pauses briefly, looking upstream before returning to the group. The gesture is small, but it reflects continuous environmental awareness. The wind moves lightly across the water's surface, creating shifting reflections that distort the landscape into soft, broken shapes. Everything feels in motion even when nothing is actively changing position. A gentle comparison comes to mind. In modern life, water often feels distant from daily routine, accessed through fixed infrastructure. Here, it is central, immediate, and continuously present in both movement and decision-making. You notice that the group does not linger in one exact configuration. Instead, it expands and contracts subtly, depending on task and need. There is no rigid structure, only fluid arrangement shaped by shared awareness. Some researchers suggest that water-based sites may have functioned as long-term anchor points within broader seasonal movement systems, while others argue that their role was primarily opportunistic and varied depending on environmental conditions. You crouch again and notice faint impressions in the wet ground. Some are recent, sharp and clear. Others are older, softened by repeated passage of time and water flow. Together, they form a layered record of movement. Scholars still debate whether such repeated use of riverbank locations reflects early forms of territorial familiarity, or whether these spaces remained open and shared across multiple groups without fixed ownership. You sit for a moment and listen more carefully. The sound of water is not just background noise, It feels like a continuous marker of place, something that defines the environment without needing to change. The group continues its steady rhythm of activity, neither fully resting nor fully moving on. It is a transitional state that feels natural here, as if the presence of water allows for both pause and progression at the same time, and as you remain with them beside the flowing stream, you begin to understand that in this world, water is not just where life stops to rest. It is where life quietly organizes itself before continuing onward again. You remain at the riverbank a little longer as the group gradually shifts its attention away from the water and back toward the surrounding landscape. The movement is subtle, almost unspoken, as if everyone senses that the pause here has reached its natural limit. Containers are secured, tools are checked, and people begin to reposition themselves for travel again. Archaeological evidence from Upper Paleolithic sites shows that injuries and physical trauma were common among early human populations, yet many individuals survive such conditions for extended periods. This is a widely established historical fact based on skeletal remains showing healed fractures as dental wear and signs of long-term care. You notice someone sitting slightly apart from the group, holding an arm in a careful position. Another individual approaches quietly and begins to examine it. There is no rush, only focused attention. The interaction feels gentle, almost practiced. A lesser-known archaeological observation is that multiple prehistoric skeletons show evidence of healing from serious injuries, suggesting that individuals were sometimes supported by their group during recovery, rather than being immediately left behind. You crouch nearby as the injured arm is slowly adjusted. A simple binding made of plant fibre and hide is applied with careful tension. The process is slow, but precise, as if the goal is not only stability but comfort within limited means. Scholars remain divided on the extent to which early human groups engaged in sustained care for injured individuals. Some interpret healed injuries as evidence of long-term caregiving, while others suggest that survival may have occurred through shorter-term support without structured care systems. Nearby, you observe others preparing to move again. There is no clear separation between caregiving and travel. Both exist within the same flow of activity, overlapping rather than interrupting each other. A quirky detail from experimental archaeology is that when researchers attempt to simulate injury treatment using prehistoric materials, they often find that even simple bindings can significantly reduce further damage when applied with consistent pressure and correct positioning. You begin to see how knowledge here is not isolated into medical or practical categories. It exists as part of general survival awareness, shared among individuals rather than assigned to specialists. One widely accepted archaeological interpretation is that evidence of healed trauma in prehistoric remains strongly indicates some level of social support and cooperation in early human groups. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by osteological analysis and comparative anthropology. You notice how the group adjusts its pace slightly to accommodate the injured individual. Movement becomes more measured, but not halted. The adjustment feels natural, as if the group's rhythm automatically incorporates variation without breaking structure. The river recedes behind you now, its sound fading gradually into the background. The environment shifts again into more open ground with scattered vegetation and uneven terrain. A gentle comparison comes to mind. In modern life, injury and recovery are often separated from daily activity through specialized spaces and systems. Here, care exists within movement itself, without separation from survival. You observe a small exchange where someone offers a supporting hand briefly while stepping over uneven ground. The assistance is momentary, but it reflects continuous awareness of others' conditions. Some researchers suggest that sustained caregiving behaviors may have contributed to the development of stronger social bonds and increased group survival rates, while others argue that such behaviors may have been situational responses rather than structured systems. You crouch briefly to examine the ground and notice how movement patterns subtly change when the group travels together with someone injured. Steps become more synchronized. spacing becomes more consistent, and pauses occur more frequently. Scholars still debate whether early human caregiving was primarily driven by emotional attachment, reciprocal survival benefits, or a combination of both influenced by environmental pressures. You begin to understand that strength in this world is not only physical, it is also expressed through patience, adjustment, and the willingness to slow down when necessary. The group continues forward, gradually re-establishing its normal rhythm. The injured individual remains within the center of movement, supported but not isolated. And as you walk with them across the uneven land, you realize that survival here is not only about avoiding danger, but also about staying together when the body itself becomes part of the challenge. You move with the group as the terrain slowly shifts into a more uncertain stretch of land. The ground is uneven in places, shaped by long weather cycles and ancient environmental changes that leave subtle rises and dips beneath your feet. The pace of travel remains steady, but there is a quieter sense of urgency now, as if the group is aware of changing conditions ahead. Evidence from Upper Paleolithic climate studies shows that early human movement patterns were strongly influenced by seasonal environmental shifts, including temperature fluctuations, resource availability, and animal migration cycles. This is a widely supported conclusion based on ice core data, sediment analysis, and faunal distribution patterns across prehistoric sites. You notice how the group occasionally pauses to reassess direction. These pauses are brief, but purposeful. No one appears uncertain, yet no one moves without some form of environmental reading first. The land is constantly being interpreted rather than simply crossed. A lesser-known archaeological observation is that certain regions show repeated occupation layers separated by periods of abandonment, suggesting that early humans returned to specific areas only when environmental conditions became favorable again. You crouch slightly as the group slows near a shallow depression in the ground. Vegetation here is thinner, and the soil appears drier. Someone bends down to inspect it closely, running fingers across the surface before signaling a subtle change in direction. Scholars remain divided on whether prehistoric mobility was primarily seasonal and predictable, or whether it was more opportunistic, shaped by immediate resource availability and environmental uncertainty. Some researchers emphasize long-term planning, while others highlight adaptive responsiveness. A quirky detail from experimental archaeology is that when modern participants are placed in dynamic outdoor environments without fixed routes, they often begin to develop consistent decision patterns based on terrain familiarity, even after limited exposure. You begin to understand how deeply responsive movement is here. The group does not simply follow a path, it creates one through continuous adjustment, reading the land as it unfolds. One widely accepted archaeological interpretation is that Upper Paleolithic humans developed flexible mobility strategies that allow them to exploit a wide range of environments across changing climates. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by settlement distribution across diverse ecological zones. You notice how attention is distributed evenly across the group. Some individuals scan the horizon, others focus on the ground, and a few maintain awareness of both. There is no fixed hierarchy in observation, only shared responsibility. The wind picks up slightly, brushing through the sparse vegetation. Its direction becomes an important cue, influencing how the group positions itself as they move forward. A gentle comparison comes to mind. In modern life, movement is often planned through fixed destinations and predefined routes. Here, direction emerges continuously through observation and adjustment. You observe a moment where the group briefly tightens formation. It is not tension, but coordination in response to subtle environmental cues that you cannot fully interpret. Some researchers suggest that such flexible movement strategies may have been crucial for human expansion into diverse habitats, while others argue that environmental necessity alone is sufficient to explain these adaptive behaviors without assuming complex planning. You crouch near a faint track in the soil, is partially eroded, but still visible enough to suggest recent movement by animals or other groups passing through the same area. Scholars still debate whether prehistoric groups maintained shared knowledge of long-distance routes across generations, or whether such knowledge was repeatedly reconstructed through direct environmental experience. The group continues forward, gradually adjusting spacing again as the terrain opens slightly. Movement becomes smoother, less interrupted, but still attentive. You realize that nothing here is random. Every step is informed by constant reading of subtle cues that would be almost invisible in a modern context. The landscape begins to feel less like a backdrop and more like a participant in the journey itself, shaping decisions as much as being travelled through. And as you continue with them across this shifting terrain, you begin to understand that survival here is not about following a fixed path, but about learning how to let the world guide each step as it comes. You continue forward with the group as the landscape subtly changes once again, becoming quieter in a different way. The openness is still present, but it feels softened, as if distance itself has thickened slightly. Movement remains steady, yet the group's awareness seems heightened, with attention constantly scanning both near and far surroundings. Studies of Upper Paleolithic environments indicate that early humans were highly sensitive to seasonal transitions, including shifts in temperature, vegetation cycles, and animal movement patterns. This is a widely established conclusion supported by environmental archaeology and long-term climate reconstructions derived from ice cores and fossilized pollen records. You notice how the group responds to small changes in light and wind. A slight dimming of brightness or a shift in airflow is enough to subtly alter direction or pace. Nothing is explicitly communicated, yet everything is understood collectively. A lesser-known archaeological observation is that some prehistoric settlement sites show evidence of rapid relocation during environmental stress periods, suggesting that mobility was not only seasonal, but also responsive to short-term ecological changes. You crouch briefly as the group slows near a patch of uneven ground. The soil here appears compacted in places, broken in others. Someone examines it closely, then signals a slight adjustment in direction. The group responds immediately without hesitation. Scholars remain divided on whether prehistoric environmental decision-making was based primarily on accumulated knowledge passed through generations, or whether it relied more on real-time observation and adaptive reasoning in each situation. A quirky detail from experimental archaeology is that when modern participants navigate unfamiliar natural environments repeatedly, they often begin to recognize subtle environmental cues such as soil texture, plant density, and wind direction, even without formal training. You begin to realize how continuously the environment is being interpreted. Nothing is passive. Every element of the landscape carries information that must be read, even if only briefly. One widely accepted archaeological interpretation is that early human survival in variable climates depended heavily on cognitive flexibility and environmental awareness. This is a mainstream historical fact, supported by settlement patterns showing successful adaptation across multiple ecological zones. You notice how spacing within the group subtly changes again. Individuals drift slightly closer together in areas where visibility decreases, then spread out again when the terrain opens. It is a constant recalibration without words. The wind moves through the area in soft, uneven pulses. Each shift seems to carry new sensory information, altering how sound and movement are perceived across the landscape. A gentle comparison comes to mind. In modern life, environmental awareness is often filtered through indirect systems like forecasts and maps. Here, the environment is experienced directly and continuously, without mediation. You observe a moment where one individual pauses longer than usual, scanning the horizon. The group does not stop entirely, but slows slightly to accommodate that observation, as if waiting for interpretation to settle. Some researchers suggest that such highly responsive group movement may reflect advanced shared attentional systems in early humans, while others argue that these behaviors can be explained through simple, social learning and environmental pressure without invoking specialized cognitive adaptations. You crouch again near faint impressions in the soil. They are partially obscured, but suggest repeated movement through this area. The group acknowledges them briefly before continuing onward. Scholars still debate whether early human groups developed stable mental representations of landscape regions, or whether their navigation relied primarily on continuous sensory input without long-term spatial abstraction. The group resumes steady movement, maintaining a balanced formation. There is no urgency, but there is constant attentiveness, as if every step is part of an ongoing conversation with the land itself. You begin to notice how deeply interconnected perception and movement are here. Nothing is separated into observation and action. They occur together in real time. And as you walk with them through this shifting and responsive landscape, you start to understand that in this world, survival is not about knowing the environment in advance, but about continuously learning it with every step you take. You continue moving with the group as the landscape begins to feel subtly different again, not in shape or structure, but in atmosphere. The openness remains, yet there is a sense of distance that feels more layered, as if the air itself carries depth. The group's pace remains steady, but their attention occasionally lifts toward the sky, suggesting a growing awareness of orientation beyond the ground alone. Archaeological research into Upper Paleolithic cognition indicates that early humans likely developed strong observational relationships with celestial patterns, including the movement of the sun, moon, and stars. This is a widely supported conclusion based on alignments found in later prehistoric structures and ethnographic comparisons with traditional hunter-gatherer societies. You notice how the group subtly adjusts its direction as the light changes. It is not abrupt, but gradual, as if they are following a pattern that exists just beyond immediate perception. The sky feels more present here, not as decoration, but as part of navigation itself. A lesser-known archaeological observation is that some prehistoric sites show orientation patterns that align with solar or lunar cycles, suggesting that early humans may have used celestial markers to support long-distance movement and seasonal timing. You crouch slightly as the group pauses near a more open stretch of ground. Someone looks upward for an extended moment, then shifts their gaze back to the horizon. A quiet adjustment in direction follows, and the group responds without hesitation. Scholars remain divided on whether early humans developed systematic celestial navigation, or whether their awareness of the sky was more general, serving as a broad seasonal indicator rather than a precise navigational tool. A quirky detail from experimental archaeology is that when modern participants are placed in unfamiliar environments without technological aids, many begin to use the position of the sun almost instinctively for orientation, even without prior training or instruction. You begin to realize how the sky functions here as a silent reference point. It does not demand attention, yet it constantly influences movement and timing. Light and shadow become subtle indicators of direction and change. One widely accepted archaeological interpretation is that increasing cognitive awareness of environmental cycles, including celestial movement, played a significant role in the development of early human time perception. This is a mainstream historical fact, supported by cross-disciplinary studies in archaeology, anthropology, and environmental science. You notice how the group occasionally slows at moments when shadows shift noticeably. These pauses are brief but deliberate, as if they are confirming alignment with something larger than the immediate landscape. The wind feels slightly different now, less enclosed and more expansive. It moves across the terrain without obstruction, carrying faint changes in temperature that the group seems to register instinctively. A gentle comparison comes to mind. In modern life, Time is often measured through devices and schedules. Here, time is experienced through light, shadow, and environmental rhythm. You observe a small interaction where one individual gestures toward the horizon after briefly observing the sun's position. The group adjusts its path slightly, maintaining cohesion without discussion. Some researchers suggest that early awareness of celestial cycles may have supported the development of seasonal planning behaviors, while others argue that such interpretations may overstate the precision of prehistoric observational systems. You crouch near a patch of ground where the vegetation appears slightly different in density. The group passes it without stopping, suggesting that it's recognized but not significant for immediate decisions. Scholars still debate whether early humans used celestial cues primarily for navigation, or whether these observations were more symbolic or seasonal in nature. Reflecting broader environmental awareness rather than technical application, the group continues forward, now moving with a subtle sense of alignment that feels connected to both earth and sky. There is no visible reference point, yet direction remains consistent. You begin to understand how orientation here is not fixed to a single system. It is distributed across multiple layers of observation, including terrain, light, and time, and as you walk with them under this open and shifting sky, you realize that in this world, direction is not something chosen once, but something continuously read from everything above and around you. You continue forward with the group as the landscape begins to feel more uncertain again, not in danger, but in subtle complexity. The open terrain is no longer uniform. Instead, it breaks into uneven layers of grass, stone, and distant movement that catches your attention only briefly before shifting away again. The group slows slightly, and their awareness becomes more concentrated. Archaeological evidence from Upper Paleolithic sites suggests that encounters between different human groups did occur, though often in limited and cautious forms. This is a widely supported conclusion based on tool material exchange, overlapping settlement traces, and genetic data indicating intermittent contact across populations. You notice the group becoming more attentive to distant movement. Heads lift more frequently. Spacing becomes more deliberate. Even silence feels more intentional, as if everyone is aware that the environment may contain more than just familiar presence. A lesser-known archaeological observation is that some sites contain tool materials sourced from regions far outside local geological availability, implying that either long-distance movement or indirect exchange networks existed between separate human groups. You crouch slightly as the group pauses near a gentle rise in the ground. From here, visibility increases. The land stretches outward in soft layers, and distant shapes become more noticeable. It is not clear whether they are natural formations or moving figures. Scholars remain divided on whether prehistoric groups engaged in regular direct encounters with other human bands, or whether most interactions occurred indirectly through shared landscapes and resource zones without sustained contact. A quirky detail from experimental archaeology is that when modern participants are placed in controlled simulations involving unknown group encounters, they often exhibit cautious observational behavior before initiating any interaction, suggesting deeply ingrained social assessment mechanisms. You begin to sense a shift in group behavior. Movements are slightly more contained, gestures more precise. There is no visible alarm, only heightened awareness, as if the possibility of encountering others is being quietly acknowledged. One widely accepted archaeological interpretation is that early human populations were not completely isolated, but instead existed within networks of intermittent contact, allowing for occasional exchange of materials and knowledge across distances. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by genetic diversity studies and artifact distribution patterns. You notice how individuals adjust their positioning again, forming a loose structure that allows for both movement and observation. The group does not stop, but it becomes more deliberate in how it moves forward. The wind carries across the open space, and with it, faint disturbances that are difficult to interpret. Every sound feels slightly amplified, every movement slightly more meaningful. A gentle comparison comes to mind. In modern life, unfamiliar encounters are often mediated through communication systems or established protocols. Here, any potential encounter must be read instantly through observation alone. You observe a brief moment where someone gestures subtly toward a distant point. The group responds by slowing further, maintaining distance while continuing to advance cautiously. Some researchers suggest that intermittent contact between prehistoric groups may have contributed to cultural diffusion, allowing technologies and ideas to spread gradually across regions. Others caution that such interpretations remain speculative due to limited direct evidence. You crouch near the ground again, noticing faint traces that could indicate previous passage by other groups or animals. The marks are ambiguous, softened by time and wind. Scholars still debate whether prehistoric interactions between groups were primarily cooperative, neutral, or competitive, with evidence supporting different scenarios depending on environmental conditions and resource availability. The group continues forward, maintaining its careful balance between movement and observation. Nothing is rushed, yet nothing is ignored. You begin to understand how uncertainty here is not something to avoid, but something to navigate continuously. Awareness becomes the primary tool for moving through situations that are not fully known. And as you walk with them across this open and quietly uncertain terrain, you realize that in this world, encountering others is not a single event, but a possibility always present at the edge of attention. You continue moving with the group as the landscape gradually softens again, and the tension from earlier begins to fade into something more reflective. The train is open, but not empty. It feels layered with traces of past movement, as if many journeys have passed through this same space long before yours. The group's pace steadies, and there is a quiet sense that the day is slowly approaching its later phase. Archaeological findings from Upper Paleolithic context indicate that repeated behaviours over long periods gradually formed structured cultural patterns, including tool traditions, shelter construction styles, and shared symbolic practices. This is a widely established conclusion supported by stratified excavation layers and consistent regional artifact similarities. You notice how the group now moves with a kind of familiarity. Even though the landscape is still changing, there is less hesitation in their steps, less need for constant reassessment. It feels as if accumulated experience is guiding movement more than immediate observation. A lesser-known archaeological observation is that gradual changes in tool design across long time spans often show continuity rather than abrupt shifts, suggesting that cultural transmission may have been slow, stable, and reinforced through repeated daily use. You crouch briefly as the group passes a slightly raised section of ground. Someone glances at it but does not stop. The recognition is subtle, as if the land has already been understood and categorized through prior experience. Scholars remain divided on whether prehistoric cultural development occurred through slow, cumulative refinement, or whether it occasionally experienced rapid shifts driven by environmental or social changes. A quirky detail from experimental archaeology is that when modern participants attempt to recreate long-term tool traditions over simulated generational periods, they naturally introduce gradual modifications even without explicit instruction, mirroring the slow evolution seen in archaeological records. You begin to see how continuity shapes everything here. Nothing appears entirely new or entirely separate from what came before. Each action feels connected to earlier patterns, even if those connections are not consciously stated. One widely accepted archaeological interpretation is that cultural transmission in early human societies relied heavily on observation, repetition, and imitation across generations, allowing knowledge to persist without written records. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by comparative studies of ethnographic hunter-gatherer groups and material culture continuity. You notice how individuals occasionally repeat small gestures that seem familiar, almost habitual. These actions are not explained, yet they carry a sense of shared understanding that does not require clarification. The wind moves steadily across the landscape, and the light begins to soften slightly, suggesting a slow transition in time. Shadows stretch longer across the ground, marking the passage of the day without any formal measure. A gentle comparison comes to mind. In modern life, cultural knowledge is often stored in documents, systems, or formal education. Here, it exists in repetition, memory, and continuous lived experience. You observe a small moment where someone adjusts a tool, then pauses to watch another individual perform a similar adjustment. There is no instruction, only mirrored behavior that reinforces shared technique. Some researchers suggest that gradual cultural evolution in prehistoric societies may have been driven by cumulative small adjustments in daily practice, while others argue that external pressures such as climate shifts may have played a more significant role in shaping change. You crouch near a patch of ground where faint traces of repeated movement are visible. The impressions overlap in layers, suggesting many passes over time rather than a single event. Scholars still debate whether cultural continuity in the Upper Paleolithic reflects strong intergenerational teaching systems, or whether it emerged organically from shared environments and repeated exposure to similar survival challenges. The group continues forward without urgency. There is no destination that feels final, only a sense of ongoing movement through a landscape that is gradually becoming more familiar again. You begin to understand how time here is not divided into sharp transitions. It accumulates slowly, shaped by repetition, memory, and the steady continuation of practice. And as you walk with them through this layered and familiar terrain, you realize that in this world, culture is not something handed down once, but something rebuilt continuously through every small action repeated across generations. You continue walking with the group as the landscape begins to soften into a quieter, more reflective space. The terrain is open again, but it no longer feels unfamiliar. Instead, there is a sense of continuity, as if everything you have seen so far is gently folding back into a larger rhythm. Movement is slower now, not because of difficulty, but because the day itself feels like it is settling. Archaeological evidence from Upper Paleolithic contexts shows that early humans gradually developed long-term patterns of adaptation that allowed them to survive across dramatically changing climates. This is a widely established conclusion supported by environmental reconstruction, artifact continuity, and genetic evidence showing population resilience across Ice Age fluctuations. You notice how the group no longer reacts strongly to every small environmental change. Instead, there is a calm attentiveness, a steady awareness that does not require constant adjustment. It feels as if experience itself has become part of how they move through the world. A lesser-known archaeological observation is that later prehistoric sites often show increased stability in settlement organization compared to earlier layers, suggesting that repeated environmental learning may have gradually led to more predictable patterns of living and movement. You walk a little further and realize the group is subtly returning toward familiar ground. The land feels increasingly recognizable, not because it is identical, but because the patterns of movement and terrain begin to echo earlier experiences. Scholars remain divided on whether this growing stability in prehistoric life represents intentional planning and environmental mastery, or whether it is simply the result of long-term adaptation without conscious long-range design. A quirky detail from experimental archaeology is that when modern participants spend extended periods learning to live in simulated prehistoric conditions, they often report that their perception of time, distance, and routine begins to shift, becoming more cyclical and less structured. You notice small signs of familiarity in the group's behavior. Movements are more relaxed. Gestures are less frequent but more confident. It feels like the need for constant interpretation has eased slightly. One widely accepted archaeological interpretation is that the development of sustained cultural adaptation during the Upper Paleolithic laid important foundations for later human societies, including more complex social structures and eventually settled communities. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by long-term archaeological sequencing and environmental correlation studies. You observe how the group occasionally pauses, not out of uncertainty, but out of recognition. The landscape itself seems to be gently confirming where they are. The wind is softer now, moving across the land in a steady, even flow. Light shifts gradually, casting long shapes that feel calm rather than urgent. Everything seems to slow into balance. A gentle comparison comes to mind. In modern life, change is often marked by clear transitions and defined milestones. Here, change happens gradually, blending into continuity without sharp boundaries. You notice a final small interaction as someone looks across the landscape and makes a simple gesture that is acknowledged without words. There is no explanation needed. Understanding is already shared. Some researchers suggest that the gradual stabilization of prehistoric lifeways may have contributed to the later emergence of agriculture and permanent settlements, while others argue that these developments were not inevitable outcomes but regionally specific responses to environmental pressures. You continue walking with them, feeling the rhythm of movement becoming almost effortless. There is no urgency left in the journey, only presence. Scholars still debate whether the transition from mobile hunter-gatherer lifeways to more settled patterns was gradual and continuous, or whether it involved multiple independent shifts across different regions of the world. You realize that nothing in this world ends suddenly. It transforms slowly, layer by layer, carried forward by memory, repetition, and adaptation. And as you remain with them in this quiet, fading light, you begin to understand that early human life was not defined by a single struggle for survival, but by an ongoing harmony with change itself, learned one step at a time across countless generations. Sweet dreams.